And Pope Benedict has a great quote, and he says, the meaning of evolution, I'm paraphrasing, he talks about the meaning, what is the meaning of evolution? He said, well, for the theory itself, that's a methodologically foreign question, right? So the scientific theory of evolution can't tell you about the meaning of it, right? But he says for a real live human person, that's the whole, that's the whole question. That's the main question that we ask.
Welcome to Stunned by Scripture, and today I have the distinct pleasure of having my guest, Dr. Daniel Kuebler. We're going to be talking about his book, Darwin and Doctrine. If you are convinced by Darwinian theory, then I highly recommend this book. If I were a Darwinist, this is the book that I would go to reconcile Darwinism with Catholic doctrine, because my guest, Dr. Kuebler, I think, affects the best reconciliation that you can. So, Dan, welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It's just new this year, correct?
Yes, yeah. Just came out this past summer.
Summer. Word on fire. So you got the backing of Bishop Barron here, and a lot of big names on the back, Stephen Barr and Chris Baglow and so on. So congratulations on the book. It's great. I'm sure it was a great deal of work, and a lot of interesting ideas in here. I've been working through it, trying to absorb, trying to understand what you're saying. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But maybe during the interview.
We've talked many times over the years. I've known you for quite some time. And I know we don't agree on everything, but I always enjoy having a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've been putting up with each other for 20 years, I think. But no, seriously, Dan, I want to really thank you, because we've had a great relationship for over 20 years teaching together at Franciscan. And I was thinking about, as I was coming over here, we may be the only Catholic theistic evolutionist and ID guy who actually talk to each other. I think all of our colleagues don't actually communicate. Have you noticed this?
I think there is, that is endemic to the evolution debate. It gets so acrimonious for some reason.
Right.
People just stop talking.
They do, even though we have so much in common. I mean, if you look at it externally, like, say an ID proponent like Michael Behe, who's got 8 kids. How many kids do you have?
6 kids.
6. I've got 8. Okay, so we're big family Catholics. Homeschooling?
No, we homeschooled a couple for a couple of years, but
for
the most part they went to the local Catholic school.
All right, so you dabbled in homeschooling, and so externally, looking at myself, Michael Behe, yourself, everybody would say, these very, very similar social, cultural, habits, but then having this difference on the nature of evolution and design and creation and so on. And to me, I find it very ironic. Like, it feels like we can't, talk. Like, you'll remember, and I'm very proud of this. You and I cooperated in that 2012 science conference that we had at Franciscan, where we had Alvin Plantinga, we had Stephen Barr, we had these big names. They all came down, representing different, viewpoints. Plantinga's kind of, he's coy about it, but he tends more towards ID, and we had Michael Behe there and others. But during the social times, I don't know if you noticed this, but all kind of the ID folk went to one end of the room, and the evolutionists went to the other room. I was like, this is not the point. So we get to actually talk to each other.
I think when it comes to these topics, I think you find that we agree on probably 90% of the fundamental issues about how God operates in the world and how science might work and so forth. And then there's a small loggerhead of disagreement. We all focus on that 10% or 5%, whatever it is. Right. And some ID people, it's only a few percent, because ID is such a broad
it's a big tent.
And so it's hard to pin down you can't really define exactly what it is. I'm not in a bad way, but it just because there are so many different views that fall into that.
It's a big tent concept. So, good. So I'm glad you're here. Thank you for making the time. I can't thank you enough. And our viewers know, this is part of a 3-part series I'm doing for this podcast, Stunned by Scripture, where I'm going to interview a theistic evolutionist, an ID proponent, and a young earth creationist, all Catholics, all faithful to the magisterium, and explore the differences in the understanding of science and the reading of Scripture, especially the reading of Scripture, because that's the focus of the podcast. To create a dialogue, to kind of break down this kind of fear and anger or acrimony and so on. I really don't like the way that we as contemporary Catholics would sooner jump on our blog and rake somebody over the coals by doing some nasty blog post about the book they just wrote or what they said in public, rather than just picking up the phone, according to Matthew 18, which is like, go to your brother, and try to have a conversation. And so, and I got turned down by a couple of theistic evolutionists that I wanted to have on, but you accepted, and I'm so grateful. I'm really so grateful, and that's always been your personality, has been very open, and that's one of the many things I admire about you. So, thanks again for being on. We like to start the show, Dan, with allowing our guests to tell their own spiritual journey. And I'm really eager to hear your own personal story, because here you are, you're well-respected spokesman for the Catholic Church's understanding of science in the U.S. You've gotten there by hard work and by your publications and by your research and gaining people's trust and so on. So you are a living example of the fact that one does not need to jettison one's Catholic faith to be active in the scientific community, to make important contributions, to be a public intellectual. So take us through. I'm sure it wasn't easy at times. I'm sure there must have been moments in your own life where you're like, do I really want to be Catholic? Does this make any sense anymore? So take us back to your childhood religious influences and so on, and what was your journey like with God like? Where did it come from? Where is that today? I know it's just super big, but
it's big. I grew up in a Catholic family. My parents were practicing Catholics. They were, we prayed together as a family. But I didn't fully, you grew up in the 80s, going to Catholic school. Say no more. I didn't fully understand my faith.
Right.
I sort of knew, what was right and wrong. I had a vague understanding, but I didn't really own my faith. I went to Catholic University as an undergraduate and didn't really know what I wanted to study. I switched my major every semester. I was accounting, I was politics, I was physics. I ended up getting an English degree at Catholic U. That was my undergraduate degree. And I started taking courses to go to med school. I was thinking, okay, well, I'll go to med school. And it was my senior year. I was taking a biology class, and this professor, Dr. Venegal Rao, who's still there, he's the department chair there.
Wow.
He had just started there. He was in his first couple of years, and he invited me to come do research in his lab. And I fell in love with that. I loved, it was, he trusted me to be in the lab by myself. He gave me experiments to do, and I just absolutely loved the discovery of things. And I was working on a bacteria virus, right? So it's not some, whoa, my gosh, this is a real sexy research. But it was just, I was able to find, there's an amino acid on this thing that actually, on this protein that's important for doing this function, And so it was really cool, even though nobody had ever found that before. Nobody really cared at the time. But it was just being able to probe nature and be able to understand that. I really fell in love with that. And so I went into a master's program at Catholic U. He asked me, he said, why don't you do your master's program? I said, I don't have the prereqs. He's like, don't worry, we'll figure it out. And so I got into the master's program there. And then, got my master's at Catholic U. And then went on to Berkeley to get my PhD in molecular and cell biology, both at Catholic and at Berkeley. And so at Catholic, I was, sort of culturally Catholic. I went to Mass every Sunday, it was, I just sort of didn't really fully, my faith hadn't become mine, right? And so it wasn't until I moved to Berkeley where my faith became mine. And it was there that people would question, why are you Catholic, right? At Catholic U, nobody sort of questioned that, just sort of, but nobody sort of, at the time, explored it very deeply, And I remember I moved out there And then my wife, who we were sort of dating at the time, she moved out, and we were living not together, living in different places, different apartments. And people asked me, why aren't you guys living together? Like, oh, your parents don't want you. And it's like, oh, well, I'm Catholic, and it became, well, I need to own this. Am I Catholic? And so that's when, particularly the influence of dating my wife at the time, I really sort of dove into trying to understand my faith. Like, what is, why do I believe this? Why? What is it about the Catholic faith that makes it worth holding on to, and the relationship with Christ and Jesus? Who is this person, and how does that affect my life, right? Because at that point, I'm making decisions that people are going to question, in the wider culture, and you have to stand up for your faith. And that's really sort of where it's interesting. That's the first time I heard about Franciscan. I grew up 2 hours from Franciscan and never had heard of Franciscan until I'm in Berkeley. So it's kind of funny how that's what sort of brought me to my faith, right? Owning it. And then I had some really good friends at Berkeley who were postdocs who they weren't religious, but they were curious about how I understood, like, particularly evolution and what the church teaches and Genesis and so forth. And I knew almost nothing about it. And so we would have conversations, and I was like, I should read a little bit about this. And I started reading. I read all kinds of books. ID books. Michael Behe's book at the time. Had just come out recently. And his first book. Darwin's Black Box. Yeah, and so I read that. I read a lot, and read. There wasn't too much in terms of Catholic theology books on evolution at the time, but there were some articles in it, and I started to, become interested in more the science of evolution, like different theories and different ideas. That's what during my time here at Franciscan. Eventually, I came to graduated and for my PhD program, and was looking for a place to go. I thought, I'm going to take a break from science. I went and worked in D.C. doing public policy work for a year.
Oh, no kidding.
Usually, people when they finish their PhD, they go do a postdoc for a couple of years and then go get a faculty position. But I just needed a break. I wanted to try something else, and they had a program for people that got their PhDs to work in the government for like a 3-year period. I lasted a year. I was like, this is not for me. It's not my personality. But during that time, I was working for a congressman, and I found, there's a job at Franciscan, and I applied and got the job, and been here for 25 years now.
So what year did you come?
I came in the fall of 2001.
Okay, 2 years before I did.
Okay.
Well, 3 years, 04. I moved here in 03, started working for the center, and then in the university in 04.
So we've both been here more than 2 decades.
Becoming a naturalized Steubenviller.
Exactly. I think I've lived.
Are your children marrying into the local community?
They're so far not.
Really?
The 2 older boys, they're the ones that are. My 2 older boys ended up going to Notre Dame, and largely because we didn't have a full-fledged engineering program. But we do now, and so which is wonderful. My daughter is a math major at Franciscan. She's
is that Carolyn?
Carolyn. She's
the pleasure of having her class. I was
class.
Very honored that you would permit her to be in my class, and I tried to be very gentle.
She's her own woman, so she'll make. Students speak so highly of your class, so she's like, I got to take Bergsman's class for
I loved having her.
Biblical studies. So, and then I have 3 in high school, but I think they're all going to be going to Franciscan. One is a senior; he'll be here next year, probably doing engineering. So I'm so grateful that we have that.
That's great. It's great that we got that. I was on the educational planning committee that was trying to get that back after we shut it down, and all that. So it's great to see that come to fruition. So, did you find higher education in the natural sciences to be hostile to Christianity?
Yeah, I didn't. I never did. I mean, obviously at Catholic U there was
it was kind of a Catholic milieu.
But even when I went to Berkeley, I ended up in a lab, and the PI, the professor that ran the lab, he was a Christian and a practicing Christian, and I think part of that, I think we clicked well, and I ended up in his lab. But there was a number of practicing Christians. I don't know of any Catholics on the faculty in my department. Berkeley's got like 6 biology departments, right? So in my biology department, there doesn't seem to be any. I don't know, but I never felt sort of hostility
Really?
towards the fact that you were a practicing Catholic, and I think most, and I think that's true for most scientists. I think that people are interested in getting their research done, and a lot of it doesn't impact the faith. You're trying to figure
Right.
out how these cancer cells,
Right.
what's genetically different
It's
from them.
bench science.
Yeah, it's bench
basically.
science, right?
Yeah.
But you do have conversations, and those things come up. And like I said, I met these postdocs would ask me, how do you they were sort of more
Yeah.
curious rather than why are you so stupid to be Catholic? So I never got that. I think there are certain fields where that might be more
the case.
More the case, but in
Yeah.
cell biology, that wasn't what I experienced. But there is, I do think there is an underlying in the scientific institutes or professional societies,
Yeah.
that it's just assumed stem cell research, embryonic stem cell research is fine. That like the
Right.
type of ethical moral framework of a Catholic is just foreign to them, and they.
yeah.
I don't think they're necessarily hostile to that. They just don't understand that, and there's not enough people advocating in those societies for them to change anything.
Right. So
Yeah.
you do run into it in the societies.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think that's similar. Well, even in biblical studies, like the societies are more hostile to faith than individual academic institutions. It's like these strong kind of unwritten code of behavior. Like you don't make any faith claims when you go to a biblical studies conference.
Yeah.
And everything has to be from a kind of a secular point of view. But that's really interesting. So it doesn't sound like you were under duress, like you were desperate to keep your faith alive during your formative years. Catholic you was a kind of at least a neutral environment, a positive vibrant.
Right.
And when you got to Berkeley, it wasn't really hostility, but it was actually prompting you to go deeper into your faith. And were there any writers, theologians, authors, thinkers, et cetera, that you found like, I really gravitate, or was really impacted by anybody in particular?
No, for me it was John Paul II. It was his writings, and that was through my wife. In fact, she loved John Paul II and had read I think everything he wrote, and I still remember making my way through George Weigel's biography of him, and then starting to read all of his encyclicals. And the thing about John Paul II that really impressed me as a scientist is that he had a deep love and appreciation for science, and saw how science could properly understood in the way that we understand modern science, using that term in the modern sense. If it was properly understood, how it could help enlighten theology, and how theology can help guide scientific discovery and understanding, so that it is harnessed for the good of humanity, right? So I really loved his stuff. But when I started to get into evolution, it was Benedict, and so he's my favorite author in terms of God. I absolutely love Pope Benedict and what he's written, and I think he's thought deeper and more profoundly about evolution than any other Catholic thinker. Anything that he writes or gets translated from the German, I want to get my hands on it and read what he says. And my wife a few years ago for my birthday gave me a framed artist drawing of a young Benedict. So I have it in my bedroom there. So I feel like my sort of approach to science and faith is informed mostly more by Benedict than anybody else.
Interesting. Yeah. Now that interests me because shortly after he began his pontificate, Cardinal Schönborn wrote an op-ed that was published in the New York Times, which is widely understood as pushing back a little bit from kind of the openness to any kind of like evolutionary theory that some of the comments that JP2 had applied. And Schönborn's article was like pushing back against a kind of random, directionless, meaningless understanding of
Yeah.
origins and so on. But I read that. That seemed to me to be more favorable to like design theory when I looked at that, and as it was widely thought that Schoenberg was doing that at the prompting of Benedict, but maybe you read it a different way, or I don't know.
Yeah, no,
Although in parts of this book, I sometimes wonder how you are different than design theory. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I think, there was a lot of layers to that article,
Yeah.
and there was a lot of responses to that article, and exactly where, how things come. And I think when I say I felt like Benedict influences my thought, it's more his worldview and his starting point rather than, and it's hard to pin down exactly where Benedict falls on this, because he doesn't really come out and say, hey, I think, but his openness to a scientific discovery with the understanding that, at the basis of everything is the logos, is reason, right?
Yeah.
And his fundamental starting principle is that either, that the world is rational and ordered because there's a reason behind it. There's a source with a capital R, or, it makes zero sense that the universe would be ordered and rational, and it started on irrationality, right? And so to me, that is like the foundation of any departure into the sciences. Like we are looking at the workings of a rational mind, right?
Yeah.
And exactly how that looks and how that comes out, those are secondary questions to me than the underlying, and that's where, I think we both share that view. Like we're looking at the workings of a rational mind, and however that works out, however that cashes out, that's not going to change that fundamental metaphysical reality that's there that makes perfect rational sense in an argument. And it doesn't make any rational sense to say this order and this beauty comes from just nothing, right? Or comes from irrationality.
Yeah, no, I loved the title of your last chapter. In the beginning was reason, matter from mind, because that's something that I push very strongly in the class that I teach on faith and science with the students. The priority of the mind to matter, and that's what you see in Genesis. In the beginning was beginning God created. So Elohim precedes the material world.
Yeah.
So you have a person. You've got personhood, you've got agency, you've got mind prior to, and then that's reversed in the dominant secular worldview that you have the Big Bang, that's matter and energy, and then mind is a epiphenomena of material processes that is at the end of an accidental process of evolution and so on. And so there you got matter before mind, and matter gives rise to mind, and that's a central narrative. So that's the narrative that I argue against when I'm teaching. But you hold something very different. When you would identify yourself as an evolutionist, you're not. You're not advocating the kind of worldview that Jerry Coyne is. It's so different. And so this is why I had a little bit of trouble, digesting the book. It's like, okay, where does Kuebler really come down? I'm trying to understand. I understand Jerry Coyne. I totally understand where he's coming from.
Very simple.
He's very simple, right?
One premise, and he just runs with it.
But this is nuance, which is again why I'll hold this up again. This is a fascinating book, a monument. If you feel compelled by Darwinian thought, check out Dr. Kuebler's book, Darwin and Doctrine.
And I'll just say about the title of the book. That's something that Word on Fire came up with, right?
I know. Okay.
And so they thought it was nice, catchy to say Darwin and Doctrine. I'm like, okay, fine, but like my view of evolution goes well beyond.
We'll get to
natural
that.
selection.
I'll give you a chance to talk about that. No, I understand.
But I
because-
like it, because it comes up in Google searches better
Yeah,
for them, and they
right.
so it's
Yeah,
a
titles are
catchy
chosen
title.
by publishers. I've been criticized in book reviews for titles, and I'm like, these guys don't understand. The title is chosen by the publisher to market.
Yes,
It's not something that
Right.
I would chosen something very nuanced,
Yeah.
and
My
it would
title
not have
was-
sold.
couldn't
right?
maybe fit on the first page.
Yeah,
My title had so
exactly.
many
Yeah,
caveats.
yeah,
Like,
so much
we can't do
nuances.
that.
Yeah. I'm totally with you. I'm sympathetic. Okay. So what would you say to the person who says, I don't believe in religion, I believe in science? There's this line from Nacho Libre, right? I believe in science, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's just the crass, kind of, going to the supermarket and running to somebody and somebody says something like that. What's your response to that?
Yeah. No, I think my response is, well, why do you believe in science, right? And if you push people far enough, right, they have to come to a point like science only works because we have rational minds and the world is rational and ordered, right? And so you can't do science or believe or trust science without making metaphysical claims, right? And so science is downstream of some metaphysical belief in the order and rationality of nature, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're going to, the only way you can believe scientific claims if you've already taken a stake, a theological or philosophical claim. And I think a lot of people don't recognize that because they don't think through of the
Right.
fundamental question is, why does science work at all?
Yeah.
Why is our mind such that we can actually look
Yeah.
at reality and see and understand the patterns that are in reality and make sense of it, right?
Yeah.
So that's one. The other thing, the second one is more mundane. It's just that this idea that science has all the answers. Like my goal in my classes, with the bio majors, particularly when I teach the bio majors to seniors, is to have them realize the limits of what we understand, right? And
Okay.
so here's the open questions, that this is the model of how a cell membrane works. Okay, well, this is what it doesn't explain. Okay, and so they can see that the science is a process. And I think every discipline is like that, right? So the whole point of going into a discipline is not to just give me all the answers and now I'm a scientist.
Right.
Give me all the answers and now I'm a theologian. Now,
Right.
there's a lot of facts, a lot of details you need to know to be a theologian. There's a lot of details and facts you need to know to be a scientist. But what makes science interesting is theorizing, right? Trying to make sense of those facts. And that goes beyond just sort of,
Right.
just go look it up in a table, right? And then try to advance and develop new theories or alternate theories and so forth.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. Everybody wants to do that in their discipline in academia, but I think a lot of students come in and don't see that's what science does. They think science is just grabbing facts from the world around it. That's not what science, that's part, but,
Sure.
but every discipline does that, but it goes well beyond that.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you for that. That's really, really quite articulate, and I'm 100% with you on that. And it's in so many areas, folks are not aware of their own presuppositions. They're not aware of their own paradigms. It's like the fish in the fishbowl. You're not aware that you're in water because you just take it for granted, and so you're making a whole bunch of assumptions that you're not conscious of because they've been given to you by your culture or by your upbringing,
Right, yeah.
something like that. And and it's something like, I don't believe in religion, I believe in science. It's presuming all kinds of things, like there's an opposition between the two. And,
Right, yeah.
and all of that. So, when we look at nature, I think you've touched on this already. But some look at the natural world and say, okay, well, it's a matter of interpretation. You could equally well interpret the natural world in a non-theistic way, or you could interpret it in a theistic way, and it's just what your paradigm is. It's just what your model is.
Yeah.
Others would say, no, it's the evidence or the data that we get from nature, leans in one way or the other. It sounds like that you're taking the position, based on rationality and order, that the data is tilted toward a theistic point of view when we just try to understand it on its own terms. Would you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, I'd agree. And I make that chapter, the 10 in the book, the last chapter, that's where I argue that. Because you can make, from any metaphysical view, right? And everybody has one. It's like nobody has a view. There's no view from nowhere.
Right, yes.
Everybody has a
Yes.
view. You can make the data fit your view,
Right.
no matter what view you have. But the question is, what's more elegant? What makes more rational sense? So, are we going to actually, evaluate these on? Well, yeah, I can make it fit, but it's really kind of crappy the way it all fits together. It's kind of messy, right? And I would argue that that the best way to understand the data that science reveals about the universe and about the order that's inherent in it is to posit a rational God behind it, a supreme reason that brings that into existence, right? But those that, again, the science opens up, to me, if we investigate the science, it reveals something about reality, and that then opens up certain metaphysical questions for us to ponder, right? And the more we know the science, it opens up different versions of the metaphysical questions. So like before, you understood sort of the huge amount of order that's there at the subatomic level, right? The balance of the forces of the weak nuclear force,
fine-tuning kind of things.
Right, sort of the fine-tuning of the universe argument, right? The
Right.
anthropic principles. So why do we have roughly 80 stable elements? That's essential for life, that's essential for evolution, that's essential for everything. Well, the reason is because there's a huge amount of order that's just there. Physicists can describe it, it's just there, right?
Yeah.
And so then that raises the metaphysical question, why do we live in such a highly ordered universe, right? And then what's the best answer for that? And there's a few answers you can come up with, but I think it really boils down to either it just is, as Bertrand Russell says, the universe just is, we don't need to explain it, which isn't satisfying, or there is a source of the order behind that, and a source of not only order, but of existence, and that's the creator, right?
Yeah.
So, and the other version is just to ignore that question, I think.
Yeah.
And I don't find that intellectually satisfying, or do I find it a good answer?
Right.
And so I think that as you probe into nature, it really pushes you in that direction if you're being honest.
Yeah, no, 100%. That was wonderfully articulate. Thank you again for that. And what I would add to that, and I don't know if you would disagree or if you would agree, but I totally agree on order, and I do think that order, bespeaks a rational mind. But I think it's more than order. I think that we have meaningful information. And the difference between order and information is that information is teleological. It's purpose driven, and order can be produced by laws. So you can have like a neutron star spinning around and causing a regular blink, and we'd say, well, that blink is on a certain period, and we can calculate that and predict that. So that's ordered. And you have the ordered rotation of the planets, and that all goes by mathematical formulae, and those are all great, but those are all predicted by law, and laws are relatively information poor in themselves. But the what I see is not only those things, which are important, absolutely important and foundational, but then especially when we get into things like the coordination of the fine-tuning of the constants, we find that it seems like there's a telos to that. There's that's goal-oriented, because as you just mentioned, all of the the cosmic constants seem to the common thing that they have is that they allow a life-supporting universe. And so you see, wow, this looks contrived. This looks like it's purpose-oriented, and then when we get into living things, we have masses of information, masses of encoded information, like in DNA and so on, all of which is purposeful. And laws by themselves, you can't write a formula that will generate a DNA sequence. It's got to be like point by point. The data's got to be put in there, just like you can't write a formula for a Shakespeare play. It's the mind has to put all that information in there. So I don't know if you disagree or agree.
I would just say that I think that there's order the universe is teeming with order. So like if you,
Right.
sorry, teeming with information, right?
Right.
And so if you define, it really depends on how you define information. I think.
Right, you
like,
can have Shannon information, which is not necessarily meaningful, but you know, I'm talking about meaningful, like the right purpose.
but the fact is, like, Shannon information can be meaningful, right? And so, for example, like there's there's information in a carbon atom, right?
Yeah.
Because it's different than a nitrogen atom, right? And so there's information all the way down, right? And so it's not as if information sort of emerges when we get to DNA. It gets more complex as you go because you take information in atoms and create new levels of information in molecules, and molecules interacting or binding to each other. That's all information, right? The information of this molecule and will more likely to bind. So it's sort of teeming with information, but and that's a little bit different than like the type of information that requires like a mind to interpret. Like, so the information in a book, those words, you need a mind to interpret that information. But there's also sort of physical information, right?
Yeah. Well,
and it doesn't mean that doesn't. It's not the product of a mind, but I think there's different grades of information, and they sort of lead into one to the next, right? And that information flows from that order. So the ordered universe allows information to be a part of the cosmos.
Right. I think you do make there's a transition when you're just talking about information that's present in the environment that can be perceived by a mind, and then you switch to actually coded information, like in language or in DNA, when the information is abstractly represented by a certain medium, either the letters on the page or the nucleic acids and so on. And so that's a kind of a quantum step to now you're coded. You've got coded information, which is again. Seems to be speak a mind, but anyway, we'll hold off on that. Let's talk about the nature of science, and you bring that up, and you give some definitions. So, teach us about science. How do you define science?
Yeah, I mean, defining science is difficult because finding the lines. There's the hard problem. There's no definition that works that defines science, and it only includes things that we sort of intuitively know as science and excludes other things. And obviously the term has changed meaning over the years. But in terms of, with my students, I always distinguish between science and sort of the classical sense, just an ordered system of knowledge, or theological sciences, philosophical science, and our modern empirical science. So what is our modern empirical science? Is the idea that a science is studying the natural world through measurement and observation. And basically it's decided that it's going to focus its questions, and these are the questions that we're going to answer, right?
Right.
Because science is a tool that's equipped to answer these type of questions. And then there's these other questions that we're going to not answer as, these are other meaningful questions that are no longer scientific questions. But in the best scenario, they're still real questions, right?
Right.
The problem arises with modern science is where, you get the scientism, where people say, well, the only questions that matter are scientific questions.
Are the ones that science
and
addresses.
Anything that science can't address is not a real question, right?
Sure.
And so, I think there's
that's
Protestant theologian,
I
can't remember his name now, but he said, clearly, the question of whether God exists or not is a factual question. It's a real question. It's either yes or no. It's a real question. And he says science can't address that question by its methods. Now, science, the data of science can be used to reflect philosophically and theologically on it, but as a scientist, I can't prove scientifically the existence or non-existence of God, because that's not something that science does. But science is part of our broad, when you think of philosophy reflects upon all of reality, right? And so it reflects on what is the meaning of the scientific data, And Pope Benedict has a great quote, and he says, the meaning of evolution. I'm paraphrasing. He talks about the meaning. What is the meaning of evolution? He said, well, for the theory itself, that's a methodologically foreign question, right? So the scientific theory of evolution can't tell you about the meaning of it, right? But he says, for a real live human person, that's the whole. That's the whole question. That's the main question that we ask. What's the meaning of the universe? What's the meaning of my life? And science can contribute things to reflect upon there, but it's not going to answer that question.
Yeah.
And so that's a long way of getting around to what science is and what it isn't in my
definitely
view.
Yeah. No, that's great, and I would agree with that completely. In the history of science, we've had like A.J. Ayers and scientific positivism and verificationism, and only that is true, which we can empirically demonstrate or logically prove. That didn't last very long in philosophy of science.
Right.
Karl Popper and falsificationism. I still think that's a useful rule of thumb, though, that if you can't falsify what you're talking about, you have to ask yourself, am I really doing natural science? Granted, there are some things that we have to assume in natural sciences that even that can't be falsified, but that we just kind of have to take on faith to make our thought processes work. Like the assumption that the natural forces are operating the same all over the universe, and we can't directly go out there and measure them, but we're kind of making an assumption. We can neither verify nor falsify, but it's a reasonable assumption. And then, in the 60s, Thomas Kuhn comes out and, the structure of scientific revolutions. And I think most of us are Kuhnians in the present day. Would you consider yourself basically a Kuhnian or not?
Yeah, I would think, that basically
we have these paradigms.
And then eventually, these paradigms either, I think it's rare that we have a collapse of a paradigm. I think more frequently that, the paradigm shifts or incorporates more things. It becomes, it gets modified, but a total collapse of a paradigm is relatively rare, I think, in scientific.
Maybe geocentrism to heliocentrism might be steady state to Big Bang, probably was a collapse of one and replacement of the
and
other.
even Newtonian to quantum physics wasn't so much a collapse. It's more of we focus on this level.
Because it wasn't like Newton was wrong,
right?
Per
so
se.
it's a simplification at higher levels, higher scales.
Sure.
So, but I do think, that there is, in the day-to-day operation of science, that's how scientists operate, in that, and it's more on the hypothesis level, right? So, because it is sort of, there's theories that are broad in scale, but most scientists deal in hypotheses. They have a small sort of thing they're looking at, and in their field, they have that hypothesis, and that's sort of this is how we operate, this is how we think, and then something happens, and then that was wrong, and we try a different hypothesis, or we just modify it. So, but I think, more often than not, we are doing more slight modifications rather than just tearing things down and rebuilding things.
Right. Yeah, we're doing normal science, like Kuhn says, trying to fit things into the paradigm, adjusting the paradigm, and as long as the paradigm doesn't get too encumbered.
Right. Yeah.
Like right now with the James Webb Space Telescope, it's these fully formed galaxies at the beginning of time. That's stressing the math of the Big Bang a bit, creating some duress there. And so, we're trying to modify the paradigm. We'll see what happens with that. That's not my area. So, but I think you'd agree that Darwinism, would you say that Darwinism is the dominant paradigm in biology?
Yeah, I mean, if we want to sort of define it, the idea that evolution is driven by natural selection, and that it operates gradually by small changes over time. I think that is the if you ask or if you look at textbooks, like high school textbooks, some introductory college textbooks, that's what's put out there, right?
Right.
But I think that, particularly in the last 15 years, it's become a more expansive view of evolutionary theory. To find someone that is a sort of a hardcore, only natural selection, only gradual, only minor change, is who actually has thought about it, right? I think there are some people that just, it doesn't affect me as a neurologist, and that's what I was taught, so it must be, I think that view is starting to become a minority view, or a view that is less held by people that actually have studied evolutionary biology, right? It's become more expansive. And it's interesting because Darwin, his view is not the view that became neo-Darwinian, right? So there's Darwin's ideas, and Darwin had all kinds of interesting and weird ideas, right?
Yeah.
And again, Darwin was a reductionist and a materialist when it came to humans, but his theory of evolution was more expansive than what became known as the neo-Darwinian theory.
Yeah.
Just one example, right? The neo-Darwinian theory says all mutations are random sort of chance, and in Darwin, in his book, In Origin of Species, he talks about the fact that we don't really know how mutations work, and at the time they didn't, right? They didn't know the genetic material, and he said there must be laws of variation. There must be some sort of law or order. He did not talk about randomness, or random doesn't come up once in Origin of Species. You can't find the word there. You can't. So so he had the idea there might be some underlying order to the genetic change or something, because he had no idea, because nobody at the time really had any idea.
Right.
He also thought, that he even talked about Lamarckianism could actually play some role, right? So this idea of sort of epigenetic inheritance, right, that we've seen, actually does play.
Yeah,
a role,
it does
right?
look Lamarckian. Yeah.
And so he was a little bit more expansive, and it got condensed, as often scientific theories do, into things that were easy to understand and model. Like, no, it's got to be gradual. It's individual natural selection working over time, insensible change, and so that view sort of hardened in the mid 20th century. But even when it hardened, there was always people that in the scientific community pushing back on that, right? About certain other ideas of and it really, in the last 20 years, so the extended evolutionary synthesis, as it's called, those ideas, I think, have reached fruition in that there's now sort of experimental evidence for some of those things, which there wasn't as well before, and I think that's made sort of the theory of evolution, this sort of mechanism behind it, much more expansive. And I think most people, and I think younger individuals in the field, they're open to that. There's no problem with that. Right?
Yeah. So there's been I've heard it described as third way evolution. Have you ever heard that terminology?
Yeah, I've heard of that. And I've heard that referred to different things. So sometimes the third way, people argue, and I'm open to this. That there are sort of natural laws of biology that we're going to uncover that are going to help understand evolution. But then there's others who say the third way is that this more expansive way of and adding these other sort of processes. We're just starting to understand and to tease apart and what can they do, what can't they do, and that type of thing.
Right. Yeah, and we'll follow up with that in a minute when we get specifically on Darwinism. But still on the idea of science, I think I had this written down, but is science the only path to finding truth? And I think you've already addressed that and basically said no, it's not. It's a constrained discipline, asking certain questions and not addressing others.
Right.
Yeah. I'm going to ask some stupid questions here, and they're not aimed at you. I'm going to ask them of each of my guests. So forgive me. They're going to sound biased, okay? But I think it's important to ask anyway. So in science, is it okay to demand proof and evidence for theories that are put forth, or should we just accept a theory because of the authority of the person or the entities that are proposing it?
Yeah. No, obviously, it's like anytime you're putting forth a theory, there should be sort of evidence that supports that theory. And the different types of theories are going to require different types of evidence.
Okay.
So for example, the thinking of evolution, right? That's a historical theory, and so that's going to there's going to be different types of evidence that you're going to be able to assemble for that than you would for the theory, like cell theory, that all life is based on cells, right? You can actually get closer and more detailed things because it's not as historical. We can look at living organisms; they have cells. Anything that has the properties of life doesn't have cell membrane and so forth. So, I think there should be some evidence, and the evidence should point in that direction. But with any theory, there's always going to be some evidence that doesn't fit, right? And that's true of
anomalous data,
and that always is there. even in the theories that are
Robust.
well established and robust. Right?
Yeah, yeah. When we're talking about theories in science, how do we distinguish between a theory and fact?
Yeah.
And how do we know when we're talking about what?
Yeah, that's a good question because students get that confused all the time, and sometimes there's you see scientists get that confused,
Yes.
right? So typically, when you say it's something's a fact, right? It's a scientific fact. It's something that anybody using the proper equipment could observe directly and measure, right? So it's a fact that I have a heart tissue in my body, right? So you could actually get MRI and go in and look and see there's a heart. Humans have 46 chromosomes in
This is
healthy.
That's not just a theory.
Right.
We have 46.
We can go
We can
and
count
look
them.
Exactly. Right. And so theories go beyond the facts, and this is where my theories are not true or false in the same way that facts are true and false. Theories are a good explanation of the facts, right, or a bad explanation, right? And so the theories are trying, and this is where I think science gets fun. And so like when you're trying to make sense of the facts, what best explains the factual data, right? And theories have to make extrapolations from that data.
Right.
So often times, the data can be interpreted in two different theories, and it's hard to distinguish them because there isn't a table to go look up and say, okay, how do we know that this theory is better than that? How do we judge? How many pieces of data? There's no. So and sometimes it comes down to subjective judgments that. I found this piece of data more important, and since this theory can explain that, I'm going to go with this theory, even though it can't explain these other pieces of data. But I don't find those pieces of data as anomalous or significant, right? And the best example I think of that people can think of with this is Galileo. Galileo's his system of the heavens. You have Tycho Brahe, who had his systems of the heavens. You also had the Ptolemaic one, and all three of them could explain some of the data. And sometimes the Tycho Brahe's system actually could explain more than Galileo's at the time.
Right.
But there were some things that Galileo could explain. It was hard to distinguish which one is the best.
Is the
best theory,
the best theory,
right?
The best paradigm that explains the data.
And part of it is which ones do you value more, and then what assumptions do you want to bring in to think, well, a good theory should do this, right? And so it can get messy at times.
Yeah. No, that's valuable. Thank you for pointing that out, because this is lost. The opening chapters of Jerry Coyne's Why Evolution is True. He's like, evolution is a fact.
Yeah. And that's the thing. If you define evolution as a change in gene frequencies over time, that is a fact, because anybody can take a population and you can measure that, right?
That's kind of a trivial definition, though.
Exactly. But so the thing, and it's also because evolution means so many different things.
Right.
You can say that is evolution, right? On a small scale, and so that is a fact. And so, but when
if that's all you mean by it,
right? But he doesn't mean that. He's trying to say so. It's important to also distinguish, like, these terms can have often different meanings, right? And some people deliberately distort those.
Right. Yeah. Do a little bit of a bait and switch where we just shift the goalposts a little bit by using a different definition of the term. But okay, I really appreciated in your book when you're on your chapter where you're talking about the nature of science, that you emphasize that it was the pursuit of truth. Right, that ultimately what's true is what we're looking for, not just confirmation of our preferences or our biases and so on. We talked a little bit about the limitations of science. Let me throw some things out here. I'd like to get your perspective on this. Is science limited to the investigation of matter and energy, or can science investigate things like intelligence as a phenomena? What about the paranormal too, like and miracles? Like, in a certain sense, the church employs science when investigating miracles. Are those things within the purview of science, and yes or no, and why or why not?
Yeah, I think those are they're a science adjacent. So science has a role in looking at those things, but a miracle, right, is not something that is sort of
it's a conclusion that's like elimination.
right. So
does not have a natural explanation.
Exactly. So the church, consults doctors and physicians and sometimes scientists. Say, can you look at this? What is this? That is a PET scan of someone with cancer. This is a PET scan with someone with it's all gone, and these are 2 days apart. Okay, from our knowledge, as a radio oncologist, whatever, I've never seen anything like this. This is what normally happens. So science can say this is what we normally see in the observations of the physical world, right? And this is something that we can't explain based on our current understanding of the physical world, right? Same thing with like paranormal things, and so it's like, but this is not something that we can explain based on our physical understanding of reality, right? And so it's more of a process of elimination, right? They say, in some kinds, science can say, oh no, that's not miraculous. That actually can be explained by X, Y, and Z. And so it can, that's John Paul II said science can sometimes purify religion from superstition. When you say, well, I think this is miraculous. Well, no, this is what's happened. It's, so it does have a role in that, but there are things that go beyond what science is going to be able to explain, right? And so it's more of, like you said, a negative conclusion.
Sure. Yeah, and as a Catholic, I assume you would probably accept the church's, and this is going to sound weird, but we have the phenomena of like exorcisms and demonic possession and so on, and I assume you don't have a problem with that. You probably acknowledge that these things do occur. Which would make you different than your typical secular evolutionist who oftentimes is committed to evolutionary theory because they think, well, it's the only viable explanation since all explanations have to be in terms of matter and energy, and so on. But you as a Catholic would acknowledge that non-material entities, like a demon, for example, can affect the physical world.
Yeah.
Just like our,
not only that, you're a non-physical entity that's affecting, like the human mind, the human mind, will, intellect, and will is a non-physical thing that is affecting the world right now as we sit and talk to each other. That's one of the things I talk about in the book. Like we know from a Catholic perspective, and it's not just from a Catholic perspective. I think you can make people make good philosophical arguments about this.
Absolutely.
Is that evolution as a natural science phenomenon can never explain the entirety of the human person, because the human person is not simply a material entity. Right. And so it's like a start, and that's something that Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis, that may, it's always, and anytime any a church document or a church official talks about evolution, that's almost always made that point.
Right. So we're all agree, we're recognizing the independence of mental phenomena and of immaterial persons like God, angels, and so on, and that they can affect material reality. Welcome back to Stunned by Scripture. There's been a little bit of a temporal gap for various reasons, but Dr. Kuebler and I are resuming our conversation, picking up from we've already discussed the general features of science from a Catholic perspective, and we're jumping into Darwinism. Just to remind everybody, we are promoting Dr. Kuebler's book, Darwin and Doctrine. Run, don't walk to your nearest bookstore and pick up a copy. I think that if you are convinced of the evidence for Darwinism, then Dr. Kuebler provides one of the best and most intellectually honest efforts at reconciling different aspects of Darwinian thought with Catholic teaching. There's Dr. Kuebler and I were talking, Deanne, we were talking that there's a huge amount that we agree on, actually. It's like most of the fundamental axioms of our thought systems are in accord, so we agree that
seems to be the case.
Yeah, sure. Scripture and nature both give us data, and we're both committed to the view that in the final analysis, that data is not going to conflict.
Right, they're going to point to the same.
Yeah, truth
Same
doesn't
ends,
contradict
yeah.
truth. God reveals himself through the book of nature and through the book of scripture. And so it's a matter of working out the details.
Yeah.
And the devil's
in the details.
yeah.
As we know.
Okay, so let's jump into Darwinism. So I'm going to throw it open. Teach us about Darwinism. What is Darwinism, and how is it different from other ideas about evolution, like Lamarckianism and vitalism? Because my students think evolution just means Darwin, but there's actually varieties of evolutionary theories. So take it away.
Yeah. So interestingly, the title of the book is Darwin and Doctrine, right? If you're looking from a scientific perspective, I wouldn't say I'm a pure Darwinist, right?
Okay.
I think it was the alliteration. They liked the title. But so Darwin's idea, right, is that the drive. So when I talk to students about evolution, I always distinguish sort of three levels, right? You have the level of historical evolution. Is the Earth old? Are there different species over time? Making no claims about how one species turns into the other or whether they're related by common descent. The second would be common descent evolution, that, hey, these different species have lived on the Earth over the past 4 billion years, basically at 3.5 billion probably, depends on when you say origin of life was, right? But roughly, all these species have lived over these different periods of time, and they're all connected by common descent, right? And some sort of bush, where they've all been related. But it doesn't necessarily say what's the process, what's the underlying process that allows species A to become species B, right? And that third level, right, I would say is, people would say sort of a naturalistic evolution. Are there natural processes that can explain how species change over time, can explain common descent, right? And so Darwin's idea was that pretty much the predominant thing that would do that would be natural selection, right? There's variation in populations. That variation is going to be associated with reproductive success, and so and this is a truism. I don't think anybody, even creationists, disagree that natural selection does occur, because it's the big question is, does it
how much can it explain?
Right, exactly. So, but Darwin thought that would be the key mechanism of explaining evolution. There would be mutations, and in Origin of Species, he it's interesting. He never uses the word random. He doesn't use chance. He talks about laws of variation. Nobody really knew at the time, sort of what genes were and the genetics, and Darwin had ideas that were wrong about that, but he thought there was just some type of changes that occurred genetically, and that led to different phenotypes, and then those would be selected over time, and that would be what would drive evolution. Darwin also thought, pretty much that it would probably happen relatively gradually and slowly, although there's places in the Origin he talks about that it would change its speed. Sometimes it would be slow, and sometimes it would be very slow. But it wasn't going to be a continuous, always happening at the same rate. But that sort of view hardened in the mid-20th century into sort of the modern synthesis, which is really that Darwinian view that that's the sole mechanism that really drives evolution. And the interesting thing is, in the last particularly 20 years, in the field of evolutionary biology, looking at sort of the natural processes that drive evolution, there has been a wealth of sort of new ideas. I put new in quotes because a lot of them are ideas that were around in the 1900s that have now come back into favor because people found evidence for them, right? And so these ideas are sort of lumped together in what's called the extended evolutionary synthesis, right? And the Darwinian view often gets looked at as, well, the organisms are sort of passive, mutations are happening to them, and then they are just shaped by these mutations, and they don't play a role in anything, right? The extended evolutionary synthesis, I think, in general, sees the organism as playing an active role, interacting with the environment, sometimes mutating itself, responding to mutations, having sort of developmental resources to accommodate mutations in ways that are surprising. So there's a whole bunch of sort of naturalistic ideas that have, within the field of evolutionary biology, this extended evolutionary synthesis, that seem to point to other processes. And some people argue they're even more important than natural selection. Some people argue they're just sort of augmenting it. Some people say natural selection is sort of shaping the phenotype, but the phenotypes are built by these other processes like developmental mutations, epigenetic changes, which are more Lamarckian. Like organisms will alter their gene expression in their offspring based on the environment they're under, and that can change the phenotype in the offspring. Or there's developmental plasticity, where organisms, the genome doesn't define the organism. It's the genome, the organism's interaction with the environment that defines what the organism looks like. And so you take an organism, put it in a slightly different environment, it actually changes its phenotype without any genetic change, right? And so these things, I just love this because it really puts, as a biologist, you're interested, I was always interested in organisms, like the living things, living creatures, and this really gives them more their autonomy back, right? That they're the things that are interacting with the environment, making changes to survive, and those changes can often be beneficial evolutionarily rather than being these passive things. Yeah.
Right. Now, what you're describing is really more similar to what was classically called vitalism, correct? Which is this idea that the organisms have some kind of life force, whatever, and that they're active and responding to their environment. And seems like Dennis Noble is moving that way.
Yeah.
And he's a recent interview I saw with him on YouTube. He seemed to be opening up to the idea of an immaterial dimension to the organism, So this brings back the idea of like an animal soul, into biology, which was heresy when I was growing up. For anybody to say that, when I was growing up, hardcore neo-Darwinism, the animal is not an agent. Hardcore neo-Darwinism, it's a process that's happening. The animal doesn't have intentions. The animal is not, thinking something, desiring something.
Yeah.
It is random mutations.
It's a
It is
robot,
this
in a
blind,
sense.
this blind process. Mm-hmm. So could you? But we went really quick there. Could we go back and could you clarify? Like, okay, we got classic Darwinism and whether Darwin believed in Darwinism.
No, that's the interesting thing.
Right, we could discuss that. But how is that distinct from, again, Lamarckianism? I think we jumped by Lamarck really quickly there. And how would it be distinct from vitalism?
Yeah, so like Lamarckianism is the idea that what was driving evolution was the organisms in response to their environment, or what they were doing in their lives would alter their genes for their benefit, and those would be passed on to the offspring. So the idea would be, hey, I go to the gym and lift a lot, and so I get big muscles, and so therefore my genes are altered because of what I'm doing, and so my kids are more likely to have large muscle mass because of something that I did in my life, right? And that's sort of the Lamarckianism idea. And that fell out of favor largely because there didn't seem to be a process by which that would occur. When they said, well, these genes get inherited sort of unaltered unless there's a mutation, right? They tend to get inherited unaltered. And so what they found over the last 20 years is these epigenetic changes. So the gene itself, the sequence of it doesn't get altered, but what gets altered is whether it gets turned on or off, and the level it gets turned on. And that can make a big difference in the phenotype of a gene is turned on to a high level in the offspring, and that can be stable for a few generations. And there's some interesting papers, particularly in mouse studies, where they find, if we teach a mouse that this particular odor is dangerous, right? They'll shock mice when they get a certain odor. Their offspring, they turn on genes, overexpress that gene, so they're much better at sensing that odor, the offspring, because it's a survival benefit. Since in the adults, it was a shock when it would be beneficial for them to not know that. So that seems to be that occurs, and so that's something that might be put into the evolutionary toolbox. Vitalism, it was sort of like there was a soul, some force within the organism That was driving evolution, almost like there's a teleology there. And it's interesting that there's been this resurgence of teleological thinking in biology with like Dennis Noble and a number of even agnostic, atheistic biologists started using sort of teleology to describe organisms as they're goal-directed. They're trying to do something. And I think that the idea that organisms are, they're developmental resources. They have their genes, the proteins, everything they use to develop their limb or whatever, are at the service of the organism. And so when things change, or there's subtle changes, the organism then uses those to make the limb or change the limb to a way that's maybe still functional, right? Rather than everything had to be built just by random change. And so there's sort of a mechanism or a process there, that there's these feedback loops that go on that can help drive evolution. Just as an example, you would think, well, if a new bone just shows up in a limb, right? You would think, okay, well, you also need a mutation to put blood vessels there. You need a mutation to put tendons there and muscles there. But in the limb, there are the developmental resource feedback loops. So anytime a bone is laid down, the cells secrete things that cause other cells there to build muscles around. So you have all these developmental resources to put things together, which it's sort of like the powers of the organism to incorporate odd things that occur and try to incorporate them in a functional way. And that's sort of more this vitalistic approach, but it just that organisms have multiple ways to get to the same end, and that's sort of a way of saying teleology, sort of like they're trying to get to an end, you disrupt it, they figure out a way around, and they get there, right? Or it might look a little bit different at the end, but they're still able to do that. And I think this is a much more accurate picture of what organisms are, as opposed to just lumbering robots that are carrying genes that are telling them what to do.
Yeah. But again, it's different than like classic hardcore materialistic neo-Darwinism, and the kind of neo-Darwinism that Richard Dawkins, for example, advanced with the selfish gene and so on. He's not open to vitalism, and he's not thinking in terms of an organism's response. A couple of things come to mind on the epigenetics. Actually, I've got a paper. I don't know if I shared that with you, but there's strong evidence that the famous beak shapes are epigenetic. And all the Darwin finches actually interbreed with one another and share genetics, and they don't differ that much genetically, but they differ significantly epigenetically. And the epigenetic differences seem to be in areas of the gene that control coloration and beak size. So there might be an irony that Darwin's finches are actually Lamarck's finches.
And there's also some evidence that some of their phenotypes are developmentally driven by the environment, like the environment interaction. So it's sort of more complex than Darwin.
Like Shetland ponies, for example, seem to be a response to being in a cold, resource poor environment, and so they kind of shrink in size and increase hair, and that's durable. So probably a lot of our domestic animal breeds have durable epigenetic characteristics that are being passed down, and could probably be bred out, like if we tried to, because the genetic structure is probably there still. The genes are probably there from the wild type, but being expressed differently. So that's so we got kind of classic Darwinism. One thing that we didn't touch on was with Lamarck, it's the classic example is giraffes. Giraffes are stretching their necks to get to the leaves, and that gets passed down to their descendants. And so their baby giraffes have longer necks. And of course that's a simplification, because there has to be all these valves in the necks to keep the blood from exploding the brain when they tip their heads down and so on. So it's not as simple as it sounds. But anyway, that's the giraffes stretch, and then their babies have longer necks. But what we didn't talk about was in Darwin, when something's selected for, we're talking about competition among the descendants and outpopulation of the adaptive trait, correct? And that's where the famous idea of survival of the fittest comes in, correct?
Yeah, the idea that there's more developmental, there's not enough resources to support all the offspring, and so there's going to be selection for certain ones that do better over time. Yeah.
So in Darwinism, you've got genetic variation going on, producing different traits among the exemplars, the individuals of a certain species. So the idea is there's a mutation that gives an adaptive advantage to one of these individuals, and so that individual survives longer and leaves more offspring, and those offspring outcompete the rest. And so after a couple of generations, all of the examples of the species have this trait that began with a single individual. Is that correct? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean that's one way that it happens, right? And so there would be that's why the process would for a species to change. It depends on how beneficial the new sort of trait is and so forth, and how big the species is and what the environmental pressure is and so forth. But that it does, populations would change over time based upon the selection for the new trait or the new phenotype. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And you distinguished when we're talking about evolution. There's really three questions, and that's I studied religion science under Alvin Plantinga at Notre Dame, and this came up, and he made the same threefold distinction. It's pretty typical. Most people do, right? So, three different questions that get conflated, but old Earth, right? And common descent, and then the mechanism is random mutation plus natural selection, and you get people that adopt different combinations of these three.
Right.
So I had Michael Behe on the show, and Michael Behe has no problem with common descent, and he's got no problem with an old Earth, but he doesn't believe that natural selection and random mutation is sufficient to do anything above the family level. So below the family, genus and species, he thinks that natural selection and random mutation can explain variation there, but there has to be some kind of infusion of information from a mind above the family level. But then you'll have young Earth creationists who will reject the old Earth and say the Earth is young, and they'll reject common descent and the mechanism.
Right.
So. And then there's other, I think Stephen Meyer probably rejects some aspects of common descent, maybe not all, and he probably rejects the mechanism, but has no problem with an old Earth.
Yeah.
So it's complicated. I point that out because some folks think, okay, it's young Earth creationism or it's hardcore Richard Dawkins style Darwinism, and so. Any point against hardcore Darwinism is a point in favor of a young Earth, and anything against a young Earth is somehow, providing support for materialism.
Right.
And it's just a real mess.
There's a million views in between.
Yeah.
And a lot of different subtleties. And that's the thing, I was to make the point that there's a lot of views, even in the scientific community, about what mechanisms are driving evolution. And most, I think the evolution biologists would not use the word random. They don't think mutations are random, right? Because and I talk about this in the book, is that when mutations occur, there is a chance element to them, but the way that organisms respond, they'll fix certain mutations more readily than other mutations, and they allow certain regions to be more mutated than others, and then they'll actively activate movement of pieces of DNA, so they can, so there is a organismic-centric change in genetics going on that you can see. So it's not just this idea that random mutations are going to drive evolution, I think is bunk. It doesn't fit with the evidence, and it doesn't seem to make make sense
Yeah.
in the way things. I still think natural processes can possibly do this, right? But the idea that it's just sort of random, when
Yeah.
anything's likely, and it's just the organisms are waiting around for things.
Yeah.
But they fix things. They actually mutate certain regions more readily. Certain genes don't get mutated as readily because of mechanisms that the organisms have.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the non-randomness though is kind of a double-edged sword because it also cuts against some of the evidence that's used for common descent. In the book, for example, you use a case where humans and apes have a common mutation in a certain gene, and that would be highly unlikely unless they shared a common ancestor. However, if mutations are non-random, which you really emphasize elsewhere, then there might be environmental factors, or there might be disease or a common virus infected both humans and those primates that induced the mutation. So that weakens the case that say common mutations between a human and an ape necessarily indicate common descent. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, to some extent, but I think one of the strongest cases for common descent is the movement of these pieces of DNA that move around in the genome. And where you find them in the exact same spot in related species, or sort of like pseudogenes that move. It's not that they exist, but they exist in the exact same spot, and they don't have to be there. The genome's huge, and if you move them a little bit, it's probably not going to have an effect. The fact that they insert in the exact same spot and are found in the exact same spot in related species is suggestive of because we know how the origin of the odds of them just hopping into the exact same spot, roughly into the same region, that could make sense, but to the exact same sort of spot really, to me, stretches the
Well,
imagination.
could it be that as our knowledge progresses, we'll come to understand that there's non-random factors about why those things settle into the genome in the place that they do?
It could be, but as we look at where they are now, there's no sequence that you find. Like, for example, there's one pseudogene where there's like 11 of them in humans and chimps, and there's no sequence they always hop into. They're found in 11 different places, and they're shared with humans, except for one that's only found in humans, and that's thought to have occurred on the lineage leading to humans. There's always a possibility of future knowledge, like debunking what we think, right? That's part of science. But I think as a scientist, we make the best inference from the data that I have, and there's no indication that there's a specific sequence where they have to jump into.
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of research on horizontal gene transfer and a lot of, crazy things. I've got literature on, snake DNA showing up in cows. Just read a paper 2 weeks ago where some Chinese researchers found a stretch of genetic material in higher primates that is very close to what's in lampreys, and but not in the intervening vertebrates that we would suppose would be putative ancestrally related features. So it seems to have jumped, from. I mean, this is the idea, I guess. They argue, I think, in the paper that you have lamprey genetics jumping into the primate lineage at some point, and then spreading around. So there's and a lot of this leads to what's called phylogenetic incongruity. I don't know if you've seen the paper from Graham Lawton that was published in New Scientist back in 2009 called Axing Darwin's Tree, where he's pointing out that the scientific community was hoping that genetics would be the key to establishing on a firmer basis the Darwinian tree of descent. But then it was discovered that when we look at RNA and compare RNA between different organisms, it leads to one tree of descent. But if we compare the DNA, it leads to a different tree of descent. And the different genes, if we look at individual genes, will produce different phylogenetic trees. And then trying to sort that all out has become a huge cottage industry within biology, trying to make sense of that.
Right. To me,
mass.
that's exciting because that shows that evolution doesn't have to happen slowly. We know there's mechanisms where organisms swap genes, right? There's transduction where, and viruses will move genes back and forth. The virus can pick up a gene in an organism and transmit it, right? And so you could see that particularly, I would say when you just had single cell life on Earth early on, that was probably more abundant because we see that happening around us today. You can sort of track these lateral horizontal gene transfers. And so that can allow for, a new phenotype to happen, or to, evolution's happening over here, and then you bring them together, fusion of organisms. So I think a lot of that actually can help speed up the evolutionary process, can help the evolutionary process search for things that are going to work in our world that are going to be beneficial. It does make it more difficult to build trees, particularly the further back you go. But what we find is that when you build a tree, and nowadays when people try to do that, rather than using one gene, right, they'll concatenate and use 30 genes or 40 genes and sequence of the 40, and you start to get trees that are much more reliable. Because there's always, there's a gene that was horizontally transferred that's going to show something odd. And so, if you look back the tree of life, looking for genes that are less likely to be involved in horizontal gene transfer, and you can figure out based on their function which ones are less likely. And those trees tend to show the standard tree of, where you have eukaryotes and archaea on one branch and bacteria on the other. But if you use genes that are more modular, that are more likely to do horizontal transfer, you can find all kinds of trees. So it just, it's something was surprising, but then when you think about what the mechanisms are that organisms have for swapping DNA, it makes sense that would disrupt our ability to build a tree on one gene. But if we look at sort of with computing resources, looking at building trees with more genes and so forth, you usually get a more robust picture, because one or two lateral gene transfer genes aren't going to influence the data. You'll see more of the vertical transfer of genes.
Although there remains a bit of mess, there's been a recent article, like mitochondrial DNA is kind of a gold standard because it doesn't recombine, and you get it from one parent and so on. So like this recent group by Toops et al., 2024, complex models of sequence evolution improve fit but not gene tree discordance for tetrapod mitogenomes. And these authors from, where is he? He's from Louisiana State, and this was 2 years ago. And I was working with a bunch of other guys, Benjamin Toops, Robert Thompson, Jeremy Brown, and they're trying to get a phylogenetic tree out of mitochondria, and they're just struggling because they're getting discordant trees showing up, both with support, but. So there's mess. There's just mess.
And there is lateral transfer of mitochondrial DNA. So even though there's no recombination, you get it from one parent, there still could be lateral transfer of that, and which could
it's going to mess things up.
Yeah.
Good. All right. So what are the strongest? What would you consider to be the strongest evidence of Darwinism?
Yeah, I mean, like, in terms of, I'm not an advocate of Darwinism in the sense that it's a materialistic process, and that's what drives it.
You're actually sounding more like a vitalist.
Of a naturalistic process of evolution. To me, right, as I look at the evidence, right, it seems to me overwhelming that common descent seems to be the best explanation of the data, right? And that you
And what data points to common descent?
yeah. So in general, the fossil record, right, points towards that the idea that when you have an evolutionary transition, right? So you say, okay, where amphibians emerged, 330 million years ago. There's no no tetrapods, land-dwelling tetrapods. So at 390 million years, right? And between those times, you find very interesting, weird fossils that are neither really good at living on land. It's not clear how they're all related, but they're found in that temporal time point, right?
Are you talking about Tiktaalik?
Well, there's a number of them, right? That why would those exist right there at that period of time? The best is that there's some evolutionary exploration of how to make a living on land. A lot of the first ones aren't very good at that because there's no competition. If they can roll around and get a plant and roll back into the water, there's no competition. But you see that sort of over and over again in the fossil record when you find sort of these intermediary forms. They're in the correct sort of temporal time points. Like, for example, in the hominid lineage, you see all these fossils between 2 and 4 million years ago in Africa that are clearly not as well adapted as, say, Homo neanderthalis or Homo sapiens like us, but they're much more adaptive than, say, the Australopithecus ones, right? And so I think that the fossil record sees, in general, why do we see these intermediary forms between these two? It seems to me that that's suggestive of common descent. I think, like, on the local levels, like a common descent of all primates, for example, like looking at and particularly seeing these sort of genetic anomalies, like processed pseudogenes, where a gene is, inserted, a copy of it, an RNA copy is inserted back into the genome at a specific location, and then the sequence degenerates at a rate that you can figure out roughly the age of it. Those tend to be in the temporal pattern, almost all of them, that you would expect given common descent, right? So the ones that are older are found in more primates. The ones that are younger are only found in humans and chimps and apes, and they're found in the exact same sequence. And there's examples of those sort of in every sort of local lineage, which just seems to suggest highly to me, common descent, as well as the development of the fossil record that, if we found, a well-developed vertebrate, 900 million years ago, that would be not suggestive of common descent. But you see the fossils relatively in the sort of the order that you would expect if, you have simpler organisms in terms of their morphology, right, in particular, developing that way. So I just see that makes much more intuitive sense than other explanations.
Okay, so your claim is, I heard two lines of evidence. One is, that at transitional stages of the fossil record, we find transitional fossils in the correct temporal sequence that we would expect them.
Well, yes, in a broad sense. So in the 30 million years where you would need to have intermediate fossils, you do find them, right? How they all relate to each other is
Is messy.
Messy, very messy, and that's you have this sort of mosaic nature of the fossil record because it's not A goes to B goes to C. It's almost like, okay, there's an opportunity to be a bipedal hominid, right? And there's all these different sort of experiments of building that slowly over a few million years. And how they're all related to each other is not very clear, but you do find them right at that time, right? That's highly suggestive that there is, evolutionary transitions that are, that there's common descent, right? That all these species are related by common descent.
Okay, and then you also mentioned mutations or degenerate genes that show up in different species that would, again, look like they've been inherited from a common ancestor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and those would be, I think, the most parsimonious explanation for why they would be there. You could come up with other explanations. I just don't find them as simple and as parsimonious, and until there's better evidence for that, I would say that the most likely scenario is that it occurred in a common ancestor in that specific this
Right.
piece of DNA jumped in right here and once, and the odds that it jumped in twice is very unlikely. The exact same spot in 2 different lineages.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Now, in the book, you mentioned the common DNA code of all living things. Although, when I look at that, I think, a programmer programs in maybe one language, and so God could have chosen the genetic language of the DNA, and like, this is the language that I'm going to write all my programs in. When I was a kid, I wrote all my programs in BASIC, Banner's all-purpose symbolic instructional code, and my different programs didn't, evolve from one to another, although there were common motifs because I'm the creator, and I might borrow from an element that I wrote in an earlier program and put that into a later program, and so on. So, Dawkins thinks that the common DNA code is just like this lockdown argument that everything descended from a common ancestor. And I scratch my head at that, and I think, well, an alternative explanation is, well, that's the code that the designer intended.
Yeah.
And then you get the problem that there's 33 different codes, actually, which are difficult to explain by natural processes. In fact, Dawkins has a quote. Let me read this quote from Dawkins about the code. He says, "Any mutation in the genetic code would have an instantly catastrophic effect, not just in one place, but throughout the whole organism. If any word changed its meaning so that it came to specify a different amino acid, just about every protein in the body would instantly change. Unlike an ordinary mutation, which might say slightly lengthen a leg, shorten a wing, or darken an eye, a change in the genetic code would change everything at once all over the body, and this would spell disaster." But when I read that, I think, is he not aware that there's over 30 variations on the genetic code listed by the NCBI? How does that happen?
Those are very slight variations, and the way it could happen is that you have the amino acids are brought in by these tRNAs that could be promiscuous and use 2 different amino acids, so you could get 2 slightly variant proteins, and over time in that species there's selection event for one or the other, right? So you have the ability to have say phenylalanine or alanine being recognized by the phenylalanine tRNA, and so over time maybe there's selection for one versus the other, but in the meantime you're able to make both proteins, right? So it's a both and. It's not. I think if you did take and say, instead of alanine we're going to put leucine in all the time and that's it, that would be problematic. But there is some promiscuity that can be built into these, the things that charge the tRNAs, where they might be able to put 2 different ones on there, 80 to 20%, sort of a promiscuity, which would lead to that different code. The thing about the code, one of the things that, and Simon Conway Morris talks about this in his book, Life Solutions. The code, it's really good in terms of being robust to mutations, right? But it's not the optimal one, right? If you look at the rate of mutation, but it's a really good one, right? And to be, you can simulate. Oh well, if we had moved some of the valine over here, it might have been a little bit better and more. So, but he says but it's suggestive then that it's not. I would think if again, I'm not God, but if a designer were to make it, you would make the optimal one resistant to.
So you think the code is not optimal?
It's very so if you look at all possible codes, it's in the really good range.
So God did pretty well, but not quite.
Right, but there does seem to be evidence that if you modify the code a little bit, it might have been. But then that raises the question: well, is it good to have a code that maybe it's in the sweet spot where it's good, but it's enough modifications so you can get evolutionary change over time, right? So that's a question we'll never be able to answer, right? But some people argue, you could argue based on sort of mutational differences between amino acids, like, okay, if we were trying to minimize mutational differences and so forth, there probably are a little bit better, a few adjustments. So that to me, but I do think that is one of the things that's suggestive of common
Yeah.
ancestry of
Yeah.
all organisms. But
Yeah, most of the variations in the code involve reassignment of the stop codon, which would seem to me to be catastrophic because it would involve a frame shift in your interpretation in the translation. And how does that happen? I mean, is there a story that explains how that's gonna you can reassign the stop codon without killing whatever it is that you?
yeah, I mean, if you what you would have to have is like a triplet that codes for amino acid, but also can code for a stop codon. So you have two, you have a protein that can stop it. So you can make a full protein and you can make a half a protein or whatnot. And so both of them are being made, and over time there's selection for the smaller proteins because of nutrient poor environments, and the smaller proteins might work fine. So there would have to be, and this is the thing you see over and over and again in evolution with alternate splicing of genes, that you can have changes that keep the original protein there, but allow for a new protein to emerge. And I think that's it's allows for this sort of gradual experimentation that goes but a wide experimentation without disrupting the original source of functionality, right? So I think you see processes of that over and over again. But.
Yeah, I got to think about that because I'm not sure I followed that. I just got to be honest about that. All right, so do you earlier we talked about this a little bit. You sound a little bit cagey about endorsing the idea of the survival of the fittest. Do you think that's a helpful category or not?
Well, I do think there is, that there is competition for research. That's certainly true. But I also think that if you look at the evolutionary process, cooperation plays a huge role, right? So the cooperation amongst organisms, symbiosis, and so forth, it drives evolution just as much as there is competition, right? And so you think of some of the major things in evolution, you have to going from single cell to multicellular organisms. That's a huge amount of competition, right? Going from a simple prokaryotic cell to a eukaryotic cell.
A huge amount of competition?
Oh, sorry, cooperation.
Cooperation. Okay,
I'm sorry.
yeah, okay.
Cooperation. So cells start to cooperate together and take on functions and rely upon each other. You get a huge amount now of other possibilities once that occurs. Same thing going from a simple cell that has no, organelles to having, fusing to prokaryotic cells to have cells that now are cooperating in a way that allow for a complexity that allows for more energy to produce bigger cells. And so I think that cooperation between organisms is a major driver of evolution. And Michael Nowak, who's a member of the Society of Catholic Sciences, he's at Harvard, a mathematical biologist, he makes this point over and over again. I think that's sort of hardwired in the evolutionary process, that there is, and this lateral and horizontal gene transfer, to me, it's almost like there's cooperation as organisms are sharing genetic information with each other, right? If they're just, competing, they would want to hoard that, right? But there's processes by which this genetic information moves from one organism to another.
So it's not exactly nature red in tooth and claw. It's like nature holding hands and helping each other out.
Well, it's both and. Again, it's certainly red in tooth and claw because there is extinction and there's death and so forth. But again, I don't think that's something that, to me, distinction and death doesn't, it's synergistic with sort of salvation history, with death and destruction that goes through that. But to me, the evolutionary process, when it comes down to it, like looking at it, I see that there's when students struggle with this, and I said, fine, if you have issues with the science, I'm happy to talk to you about this. But the idea that a creator God produces a universe in which that his creation is able to, over time, produce new forms and so forth, through his primary causation, he is allowing, so if we can show that, humans emerge from the human body, human form emerges from other primates, to me that doesn't in any way detract from God's grandeur or God's role as creator, God's providence over creation, or the importance of humans. It's, to me, like we are the end product of creation, like that we are the crown of creation, and we come forth from creation. Right? And from all eternity, God had,
you would say we're intended
Yeah, we're intended from God's perspective. And
So it's not a, yeah. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I mean that's a very important distinction because in evolutionary theory, there's some that argue that if you reran the tape, it would always end up with what we have.
yeah.
And there's others that say if we reran the tape, it could
totally
be
different set.
anything could have happened.
Yeah.
And so there's teleological understandings of evolution. There's non-teleological understandings. You're arguing for a teleological understanding that God did have an end goal in mind. Yeah. And in passages of the book, you really sound more like what's called a front-loaded design advocate. Yeah. That you think that the underlying order in the original
the chemistry and the physics.
That everything necessary is kind of embedded in the initial conditions, and then it works out towards what was intended. And that's very different, than say what Richard Dawkins is advocating, for sure. or
Yeah. So either of those views, I think, so from a Catholic perspective, the view that everything that occurs is sort of unpredictable from a human standpoint, and chance is driving it. There's no really underlying order, but this is what we got. If we ran it again, we get something different. Either that view or the view that I hold, largely, is that the underlying order at the beginning doesn't dictate exactly everything that's going to happen, but the general picture of what will work is sort of there, given the chemistry and physics. And I make the argument for that in that one of the chapters in the book, and a lot of it deals with Simon Conway Morris stuff. But I think both of those are, one is explicitly teleological, right? I think the other one, though, from God's perspective, God, when God creates, He knows all that is going to happen. So whether if it's unpredictable from the human standpoint, makes no difference from the perspective of God. That God, when He created, right, even if this creation, there was an elements of chance in it and so forth, God knows that from all eternity. The end product He knows from all eternity, right? So from a philosophical point of view, I don't think either one is problematic from a Catholic standpoint or a Christian standpoint. I just think that that the order in the physics and chemistry is so beautiful and so deep and so impactful on the evolutionary process that it sort of directs and drives evolution in certain directions. And so the chance elements are sort of uncovering, the underlying order that sort of exists there, and the underlying possibilities. And so, and the idea of convergence, I think, that I talk about, where similar things seem to evolve independently over and over again, seems to suggest that there's some order there. And when I talk about protein evolution, is one of the biggest examples of convergent evolution that I think exists.
When you speak that way in the book, it sounds to me like kind of what's called in other circles front-loaded design. Like the initial conditions have the necessary ingredients for the final outcome, and it's a unfolding of that, like an acorn unfolding into an oak tree, essentially. That's very different than other views. So, Darwin believed, and he uses phrases similar to this all through his book, which I took the time to read. So probably you, me, and like 19 other people in the country have actually read this. But numerous successive slight variations accumulate over time to create eventually massive change. And he also his vision was that when you move from one species to another, you have this long chain of successive transitions, and the difference between the transitional species in that long chain would be almost imperceptible. But at the end of the process, you started with a fish and you got a frog at the end. Is that the way you see it happening as well, or
Yeah, no,
differently?
I don't think so. And at the time of Darwin, there was a lot of debate. The saltationist theories
Right.
that there would be bigger changes and there'd be some smaller changes. Darwin, he very much was on the idea that most change was going to be gradual and slow, and that's how things hardened sort of in the modern synthesis in the mid 20th
Right.
century. But I think, as we understand sort of developmental mutations, we understand mutations and the way lateral gene transfer, where a whole gene can be moved from one species to the other. I think that it's becoming clear that you're not going to have insensible gradations. You will have intermediary forms, right? But you could have, a form that increases brain size 10% in one generation or something like that, right? Because of like a developmental change where you have a new bone that's integrated into a limb in one generation with a single mutation, right? Because of the sort of the developmental resources I was saying before. Once a bone is put into a mutation that, changes, the bone being put in one location to now in two locations, some type of overexpression of that. The bone cells then interact with the other things in the limb to wire it up in a way that could be functional, right? So you don't need to have, so you could have like larger scale changes like that, right?
So you're willing to think of like saltations to a certain degree, at
to
least?
a certain degree, yeah,
Yeah.
right. And so not everything has to
Is there
be,
limits to how much you can jump in a?
There probably is, yeah. I think there's limits to, the developmental resources that an organism has and the environment that it's in. So there are certain saltations that are going to be, detrimental, and there'll be a lot of them that'll be detrimental. But there are certain leaps that could be, and again, leaps in quotes because it's all in the perspective of how big. Where Darwin thought, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the species, and I think I think that there are going to be those leaps, and there's also going to be a lot of difficulties of putting the fossil record together, because there's a lot of these experimentations that when I say experimentations, when you're trying to a new niche opens up, you don't have a well adapted phenotype in that niche, right? And so if you do it kind of well, you can survive for a while until somebody else does it better, and then you're gone. And then one form sort of, or one or a couple forms sort of emerge out of that sort of bush.
That's survival of the fittest.
There is, there's going to be some survival of the fittest, is that out of that emerges, it's sort of, in my view, in the hominid fossil record, the hominids being any species that's more closely related to us than to modern chimps, right? In the hominid lineage, there's a lot of variations and a lot of question marks about how are all these species, how are they all related to each other? Who's the ancestor of who?
Right.
Are these just local variants, right? There's a lot of mosaicism, right? So this species, the brain size looks more modern, but it's got a really big jaw. That looks more ancient, right? But this one has a small jaw. It looks more modern, but it's got a smaller brain size, so it looks more. So it's not clear, how they're all related. But it's you see, to me, the thing that needs explanation is, why do you have all of these sort of interesting sort of intermediary forms that are in that particular
time period,
and and they're all so often over the place, and it seems pretty clear that some of them were hybrids, right? Like the species could, we know from the genetic evidence, seems that modern humans and Neanderthals were able to interbreed, and so you have these, different fossil.
I think
forms
Neanderthals were human, but that's
okay,
a different. We don't need to argue about it, but so you get the variation, right? Now in Darwinism, well, there's Darwin's view, and then there's whatever you think yourself. But as I understand it, his view dictates that smaller changes show up first, right? So you start with the LUCA, right? Last universal common ancestor, right? And then you get species distinctions would show up, and then genre distinctions would show up, and then family distinctions. Is that correct? Is that how he viewed it?
Yeah, he would have thought that yeah, you would start to get more diversification from those original forms.
So
right?
the bigger morphological differences would show up later in the process, correct?
Yeah, the bigger morphological differences, but that doesn't necessarily mean a lot of the genetic differences that wouldn't show up earlier in terms of metabolism and ways of making a living that would predate the big morphological changes that might occur later on, like multicellular organisms and things like that. Right?
Yeah. And is that how you view it too? Do you think that in the history of life, like smaller changes appear first and then larger changes?
Yeah. I mean, again, I wouldn't necessarily say smaller changes because we were talking about
or
genetic
differences.
the genetic differences.
Species differences before genre differences, or
yeah, you would start to see, the like early cells start to take on, but they might not, because they're swapping genes, and a lot of times through this horizontal gene transfer, they're sort of exploring ways to make a living as single-celled, and you start to get over time, right, different, more divergence in ways of making. This one makes a living off of sulfur compounds. This one makes a living at high temperatures. This one makes a living off of photosynthesis, right? And so those things start to occur, and they would occur, from a common group of ancestors at least, right? And then over time you would get bigger divergences. But once you have, the vertebrate, right, lineage, right? Once you get that developmental process, you're just going to get vertebrates out of that, right? So there's a period of time where there's enough plasticity where you can try different developmental pathways. But once you're on, say, the arthropod pathway, you're stuck on that pathway. And so that lineage is either just going to make more arthropods or it's going to go extinct, right? You're not going to go from arthropod to vertebrate. But there's a time where you don't have either arthropods or vertebrate, where those are possibilities. And that you sort of build those through genetic and rearranging, sort of genetic expression and so forth.
Yeah, okay. Right. Well, I'm considering whether we want to jump into talking about the fossil record immediately, but maybe I'll hold off on that. So you don't. I think we talked about this. Dawkins insists on gradualism in his view of Darwinism. He says a key feature of evolution is gradualness. This is a matter of principle rather than fact, he says. It's kind of a curious thing to say. Yeah. Evolution is very possibly not, in actual fact, always gradual, but it must be gradual when it is being used to explain the coming into existence of complicated, apparently designed objects like eyes, for if it is not gradual in these cases, it ceases to have any explanatory power at all. Without gradualness, in these cases, we are back to miracle, which is simply a synonym for total absence of explanation. So that's River Out of Eden.
Yeah.
Respond to that. What do you think? Do you agree that evolution should be gradual if it has explanatory power, or?
Yeah. I don't necessarily. Evolution has to be functional at every step, right?
Okay.
And that's the key. Is there's some functionality there. Whether it's, again, it depends how you define gradual, right? But I don't think that it has to be gradual, where you can get a relatively large change as long as it's functional. And the functionality is the key. And the key thing is to always keep in mind is that the organism has resources to adapt during development to different perturbations, right? Different changes, where that allows it to often have a surprising new phenotype with a small genetic change, right? And so that to me is the key. It's not that it's gradual, but that it's functional, and the level at which it's too big of a leap where it destroys the organism, or it's hard to know. And I really think that the genetic swapping, right, or hybridization, these things play a much bigger role in getting new phenotypes in one generation, right? And that can lead to more, not gradualism, but more saltationism, right? Being more on that range, where you have a functional new phenotype because you bring together a lot of different genetic change in a hybrid. That does seem to be, pretty common, not only just amongst plants, but other species as well.
Okay. So you don't agree with the gradualism thing?
No, I
There
don't
can
think
be jumps in phenotype.
there can be, but
Yeah.
again, I think it would be there's certain jumps that I would say that's just so unlikely to occur. Like, it's not like you're going to go from no eye to a a complex eye like you and I
Yeah.
have, like a vertebrate. No,
Yeah.
that's not going to happen. But you
Okay.
can.
Well, that sort of happens in the fossil record, because when you move from the Ediacaran period to the Cambrian period, you go from, and for those of our listeners, the Ediacaran's like 600 million years ago to about 535 million years ago.
Oh.
And then there's a very small temporal gap of like 500,000 years. And then all of a sudden you start getting the Cambrian cohort. All the Ediacaran are gone. And the Ediacaran fauna. Well, let me.
Yeah.
We better as well just jump into the fossil record here. So I think a lot of our viewers and so on probably have the impression that the fossil record shows a single-celled creature showing up 3.8 million years ago, and then gradually we get maybe more complex creatures, and then simple metazoans or multicelled creatures show up, and then there's this even gradual development through the millennia until we get to the current age. But what actually is there is, as soon as the Earth cools, we have unicellular life, which kind of shows up in a bang. And then we get unicellular life all the way to the Ediacaran 600 million years ago. And then in the Ediacaran, for the first time, we get metazoans, like the visible creatures, but they don't have any limbs, they don't have internal organs, they don't have eyes, hearts, etc. They're like simple frond-like and sessile, non-mobile animals that look plant-like, and they seem to dominate for several million years, 600 million years to about 535 million years ago. Then they disappear, and then we get the Cambrian ensemble, and then all the major phyla of animal metazoa. And we can quibble about exactly how many phyla, but the majority of the phyla show up all at once, and we have vertebrates, or at least chordates, well, fish, early fish, jawless fish, granted, but and then we have arthropods and all the kind of exotic phyla. Like half the phyla are marine worms that most people don't think about, like preapulids and all these sort of creatures. And that's kind of a mystery, because those different phyla, people say, well, what's a phyla? Phyla is a different body plan of animal. And they all show up about 535 million years ago in a geological blink of the eye without transitional fossils to the Ediacaran, and kind of out of nowhere. And so, how does, and because, Steve Meyer and others have pointed this out, and Darwin himself, admitted that this is a major problem for common descent, because you lack both ancestors and transitions between these different major types of animal clades. So is that not a problem for the whole common descent paradigm, or how do you approach
I don't necessarily think that's a problem for the whole common descent paradigm, because again, you're going from over time simpler to more complex. I mean, clearly that's the pattern that the fossil record sort of demonstrates. They're simpler. In general, the Ediacaran, everybody agrees, they're simpler, less complex organisms than what you find in the Cambrian. So it has that pattern, right? And then if you look at sort of the Ediacaran fauna, you do see examples of all of the major things that are going to occur in the Cambrian there. They just sort of explode relative to what you see in the Ediacaran. So you see bilateral organisms in the Ediacaran, right? you see like a worm that's got obviously looks like segmented, that has sort of an anterior and a posterior end. You see some lightly biomineralized, like hardened fossils, like these cone-shaped fossils that are starting to have, it's like a mineralized hard body parts, right? But the bilateral hard body parts with a central sort of nervous system is sort of really what takes off in the Cambrian. But you see, and again, it's not clear how A is related to B and C, but you see examples of that. You see examples of, burrows and trails for like of the motile structure. So yeah, it is dominated largely by sessile, floating, non-attacking, creatures. But once you get into the Cambrian, and within 10 million years, everything is different, right? And so the question is, well, why does that happen? Why did those traits that you see here and there in the Ediacaran suddenly just take off in the Cambrian? And nobody really is sure, but there's a lot of possible sort of explanations for that. So, once you have organisms that are predators, right? That once you get the first organism that can, eat these big sessile creatures, they're gonna go extinct very rapidly, and there's going to be sort of an evolutionary arms race. There's also needs to have larger organisms with hard body shells and so forth to have ones that are even bigger and be more abundant. There has to be a lot of energy, right? There's got to be, so oxygen levels, right? So if oxygen levels increase, having you can make more energy and you can have now more body size. So there's certain environmental triggers that would change the whole ecosystem, very, very rapidly, geologically speaking, in a matter of a couple million years. So to me, it's a very interesting, event, but it doesn't undermine my idea of, oh, well, there must be, we need to throw common descent out. There are certain organisms in there that some people argue, well, that looks kind of like a mollusk, a pre-mollusk, right? And there's debate back and forth about that. But so there are a lot of organisms in the Ediacaran where there's debate about what they are. They're certainly less complex. They're certainly not as big. They certainly have hard body parts. But the fact that you see them in that temporal sequence, you start to see these pieces here that have these traits. And then you see 10 million years later, they take off. And so, but the traits are, segmentation, hard body parts, and mineralization are already starting to show up. But it's not clear, okay, that's clearly an early chordate, and that's clearly an early mollusk. And so those aren't there. But you probably have all the genetic material for biomineralization. You have the genetic material for segmentation. You have the genetic material for those. But to have those become, as robust and diverse requires certain environments. Certain environments aren't going to favor that, right? There's a lot of environments where having a big body size isn't going to work because you just can't get enough nutrients. But once you have an environment where that's beneficial, things start to, and then things snowball. It's like a major economic change where certain things are going to go extinct and other things are going to take over.
Yeah, and this is all happening by natural selection operating on mutations?
Well, it's all these processes of the extended evolutionary synthesis, right? So organisms are able to respond to their environment and modify their phenotype. They're able to modify their genome in response to the environment. There's natural selection going on. There can be epigenetic changes. There can be symbiosis of gene swapping. So there's a lot of processes that are going on where organisms are adapting to these new changes, and those lead to sort of new phenotypes, right? Could be.
Yeah, now all of the, I think it's on pages 114 and 115 in your book, you list all of the different ancillary modalities besides natural selection working on random mutation that make up the extended evolutionary synthesis. So evo, devo, and epigenetics, and so on. Now, when I look at those, none of those additional modalities actually create new genetic information. Some involve swapping, like horizontal gene swap involves swapping it. Evo, devo would involve switching the order of development, which is usually lethal, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. Epigenetics affects the expression of the genetic information. But do any of those extended modalities or modalities that you list in the EES, do you claim that any of those create new genetic information?
Well, the new genetic information would be created largely by duplication of different pieces of chromosomes and different movement of like pieces of genes from one exon shuffling. I talk a little bit about that in the book. And so taking a gene and duplicating it, that gene can then take on a new function, right, over time, where it was mainly good at modifying aldehydes, and now it can modify, aldehydes and maybe, something, a ketone or something like that. So there is, increase in sort of gene families over time that, they are globin genes that bind oxygen, right? And over time, they bind oxygen at different affinities, right? And so they become very good at binding oxygen at low affinity for the embryo or the fetus, right? And so that would be an increase in genetic information over time.
And that's taking place by mutations and natural selection.
It's going to take place by mutations and natural selection, and also it could be taking place by directed movements of DNA. So where but where the cell activates transposons that move DNA, that pop around, and when they pop around, they often move pieces of DNA with them, and they're more likely to insert in certain places. And so that is sort of there's a chance element to that, but it's sort of actively directed in some cases and accelerated by the organisms based on environmental challenges and so forth.
When you talk about the organism directing, is that a purely mechanistic process? Are you envisioning that there are mechanical mechanisms in the cell, material mechanisms that are set up to respond to environment and so on and cascade down to affect? Or are you imagining that there's an immaterial component to the organism that's directing, like an animal soul that has a kind of like a will or an instinct?
Yeah, no, I would say it's a mechanism that the organism has, right? The soul is what makes the organism what it is. But how does the organism work? It's the ways the organism, the bacteria works in the way that scientists can explain. There's not sort of an immaterial magic necessarily going on. The soul is the fact that it's a unity and it is a thing and an entity that has a goal and a teleos. But how does it get towards that goal and that teleos is through those processes that it has at its disposal.
It's always a mechanistic process.
Yes, that's under the
there's a
powers of
trigger and a cascade and so on. So when we say so we're anthropomorphizing a little bit when we say the cell directs.
Yes, and it's hard not to because we're human to use those terms, but in a sense, the cell is not a passive player. The cell, in a sense, has goals and a teleos that it's operating towards, but it's not consciously aware of that and thinking, I need to do this and that. But the way it's ordered is structured so that it can respond to its environment in a way that's going to benefit, and it responds to novel challenges, often to do surprising things.
Okay.
Because it's not linear, easily predicted things. Yeah.
Right. So the cell is behaving in a way that appears to have a kind of intelligence to it. But there's no immaterial component here. It's an ensemble of material processes, all of which ultimately were built up by mutations being selected by natural selection. Is that correct?
It's built up by all the processes that the extended evolutionary synthesis talks about. But it is a living organism, as St. Thomas says. It has a soul, right? But that soul is like, as a scientist trying to understand how the bacteria does what it does, it is through the orderly directed material processes that it has. Just like, why does your liver function in the way it does, John? It's because of the material processes in the liver. It's not as if your soul is not directing your liver to.
I'm not rationally, but the body seems to have kind of like a like a non-conscious intelligence to it. You know, our bodies, our bodies and the bodies of most organisms respond in ways that we perceive as intelligent to the environment.
Yeah, yeah, and we just have to make sure that we're using intelligence in a different way than we're using when we talk about human intelligence, right? So they certainly
Not conscious and rational.
Yeah, right. But there is an intelligence in organisms, and I think that's something that the thinkers like of the extended evolutionary synthesis point out, that there is an intelligence and an order there in the cell.
Right.
Yeah. So.
It would seem that neo-Darwinism, where you have random mutation, well, it's not random, or you would argue it's not random, but you got mutations that are being selected for. Okay, and does this typically happen one mutation at a time, and then you accumulate, like if we need a new protein for a new function. Is this an accumulation of mutations, until you have like a protein consisting of 2,000 amino acids that has a certain shape to it and then takes on a function in the cell? Or what is going on there?
Yeah, so most likely, like when you're getting a new function, it's a duplication, an alteration of what's already there, or it's the fusion of different domains of proteins that exist. So now you have a protein that's got 3 new domains that were used in other proteins, and now they're in a separate protein, and they take on a slightly different function. And so, but there is, the individual mutations, like single base pair mutations, can have a role in doing that, but building sort of the genetic information is going to be, you pick up a new gene from this organism, or there's a hybridization where you get this, or you have a gene duplication, or exons that move from one gene to another, a copying of them, where they don't destroy the old function, but allow you to have a new function. And you see this is something that in evolution and in biology you see over and over again. You see the same molecules being used multiple ways for all types of different things. So the evolution uses a molecule that now can be used for X, and now it's used for Y, and it's used for Z, or there's a slight modification. So you have X used here and then Y used here. And so I think that there is a lot of people say, it's got to be this mutation, and then this point mutation, and this point mutation, and this point mutation. And it's got to be like really, one after the other. I think that is missing, like all the other mechanisms to modify the genome and the complexity that the genome has. Because we think of the genome as really static, but if you look at your genome and mine, there's like places where you have 100,000 base pairs and I don't, and so it's much more, variable from person to person than we think. Where it lines up, we're almost identical, but there's a lot of places where things are inverted, and so there's a lot more going on that we understand, like that can drive, phenotypic change with that.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. I'd love to ask you about human evolution and just where, because I talk about this in the book, and I think this is one of the questions that a lot of people, sort of have about this. And I often get, the objection to from an evolutionary standpoint, if you take all 3 of those, common descent and natural processes, well, that means that humans have come from other hominids.
Right.
And so that humans are the product of non-rational creatures, and that often seems to be something that people recoil at or struggle with from a Catholic perspective. I mean, is that something that animates, that drives your thinking on this, or do you have any issue with that if evolution were true? Is there something that,
right?
Yeah.
No. I just go with what Pius XII taught in Humani Generis. That it's possible that the human being could come from, living precursors. I can't rule it out theologically. The church hasn't ruled it out. If you ask me, do I think it happened? No, I don't, because there's significant genetic differences between us and other primates that I don't think would happen by naturalistic processes within the window of time allowed by the fossil record. So even a 2% difference with a presumable chimp ancestor is millions of base pairs, and for those to accumulate by mutations and selection within the window of time that's available, I think is preposterous. No, I think I don't buy common descent, I guess. But theoretically, I don't have I'm not going to go beyond what the church says and say that it's not theoretically possible.
Yeah, no, I think, and I talk about this in the book, and to me, that there's a sort of a fittingness there. Like when we try to understand, like Adam, we need to understand through Christ, right? And so I talk about this idea that humans emerge in the womb of a hominid creature, right? And Christ, how does he emerge? He emerges in the womb of a mere creature, and it's the scandal of the incarnation, right? And so how would it be beneath us to emerge from the womb of a creature if that's how God has intended us to come? At a certain point in the evolutionary process, a sperm and egg come together that are the type of thing that's different enough that is fitting to have a rational soul, and that is the first rational creature conceived without sin at the beginning of the dawn of humanity. And that sort of is the way that we all are conceived. We're all brought in, right? It's through this natural process. Within that natural process, like the sperm and egg don't explain all of you, right? There's more, but it goes with that, right? And so to me, there's a nice a fittingness there that's how Christ enters the world as a one cell, a zygote, and in the womb of a mere creature, and that's how humans would have entered the world, as a one cell zygote, and had gone through all the developmental stages with the preternatural gifts. So they would have had the ability to learn language and know God, because that's the church teaches that our first parents had those gifts. So just like Christ went through all the stages of humanity, right? I just find something very much compelling and beautiful to see that God is, to me, that God would make a creation that brings forth humans in the fullness of time to know and love Him from creation, and creation is prepared humanity in a sense, at least the physical aspects of humanity. But we obviously are more than that, and to me that seems to it really resonates with like how does Mary come into the world and how does Christ come into the world, and there's a sort of a parallel between the origin of humans and the incarnation and the Immaculate Conception, and it's, I think, less scandalous than the scandal of the incarnation of God coming into a creature versus humans coming from creation.
Sure,
right?
Sure, yeah. No, I respect that you have a good treatment of the theology of the development of the human person, a good rhetorical way of dealing with that, which I respect. And you're trying to engage the data of Scripture and church teaching in a way that respects the the parameters that the church has laid out. So why don't we move to that, in fact, and you deal with this in the book. What are the major theological guideposts that we need to keep in mind when we speculate about the origins of humanity, and Adam and Eve, as it were, and our first parents and stuff like that? What do you see as those being?
I think the key parameters that are non-negotiable for Catholics are that all humans are related by common descent. Like all of us that exist today, we come from a first group, parents. And so that's the one thing, it's non-negotiable from a Catholic perspective. There wasn't humans emerge in Africa and then some other humans emerge in Asia and so forth, that we all emerged from.
But you see it as a breeding population of apes that gives rise to humans, rather than like a original human pair, like an Adam and Eve.
Right, and so I think that the church is sort of silent on, like you said, from the argument that the first humans could have emerged from, very advanced hominid, right? And some of these hominid species seem to be very, very advanced, right? But not a creature that is fitting to have a rational soul. So, but the first parents emerged from those, and all of us have descended from that, right? And so that universal common descent, not evolutionary, but
right.
but the church does
human common descent.
right? Universal human common descent. That's a.
Was there a first parents of the human race in some sense, or not?
Yeah. So I mean, this is one of the big questions that I'll get to that in a second. But just the other major thing is that evolution is never going to be able to explain the totality of the human person, right? That's the other sort of non-negotiable theological position, right? So in terms of that evolution can maybe explain some material process, but that's not enough, right? And just like fertilization, studying conception can explain the material processes of how we come into existence, but that's not enough, right? So science is limited in that sense, that evolution is never going to be able to explain the totality of man. And then, that we know that man was also made in a state of pre-lapsarian state, before original sin, with the preternatural gift. So our first parents were in a state different than you and I, right? And so those are the things that those sort of three things that the church teaches that you have to sort of fit into that evolutionary theory.
And did you include in there like a historical fall, like?
Yeah. Well, assuming that our first parents fall, right?
Sure.
So our first parents have the preternatural gifts. They turn away from God, and so they fall, and then everybody else inherits human nature without the preternatural gifts, and so we're all fallen. And that's why the church says that all humans have common descent of humans from an original ancestor, original pair or group.
Right.
And this is the thing where I talk about in the book, the idea of like, was there an initial Adam and Eve, or was there an initial population, right? And this is where I think Pope Pius, in Humani Generis, this is the only, I think, encyclical that references this. It says that Catholics are not free to embrace the idea of there being a first group of humans, that there has to be a pair, an Adam and Eve, right? But it's interesting the language that he used, because he said because they're not free to embrace. He didn't say it was heretical, you couldn't hold this position or you couldn't entertain this position. And he also said at the end of that, he said, because it's not clear
how it can be reconciled. It's not apparent.
Not apparent how it can be reconciled with original sin. So it seems to me that the issue for him is like, and there's a lot of theologians, mostly Protestant, that just get rid of original sin. Like, well, evolution shows there's no original sin, whatever. But he said no, that it's not apparent to him how to maintain original sin. And original sin is the key thing. That's the thing that does the sort of the heavy theological lifting, right, in Catholic theology. So if you have a view of evolution that gets rid of original sin, that's problematic. And it's interesting. Kenneth Kemp, who's a philosopher, he had just had a book that came out at CUA Press. Where he talks about the evolution, the first 100 years of what the church wrote and different church documents, and he talks about how Humani Generis, there was different versions of that being put forth, and one of them was very strong language saying that you cannot hold, that there was a first group of parents, right? And the Pope really struck that language and went with the softer language, right? So it seems, and the church then has not followed up with any sort of clarification of that since that time. And so, from my perspective, it seems that you could try to see, would a sort of a first human group could work if you could reconcile that with original sin, right? Kenneth Kemp has an idea of reconciling original sin with an original couple that then mates with non-humans and so forth. So he has different views on this. But I think, to me, I have my view on this. It's like, yeah, I don't know. Nobody really knows exactly how this would work. But I think a polygenic sort of origin, where of humans, a number of humans emerge in the same generation, could work with original sin in much the same way as you have a population of humans that are pre-lapsarian, in a state of grace with the preternatural gifts, and they all collectively decide to turn away from God, and sort of like Aaron, building the golden calf, and all the Israelites worship. The fall is a communal thing, so everybody falls, and then the human population is devoid of the preternatural gifts. I don't know, theologically that there would be an obvious issue with that, and the church hasn't said.
So you'd have to read the narrative of Adam and Eve as referring to actually a group rather than individuals.
Yeah, you could, or you could read Adam and Eve as sort of the head of that group, right? As the Adam is sort of the priest figure of that group who decides to bring everybody to agree to turn away from God in some way, shape, or form. And as John Paul II says that the story of the fall uses figurative language to describe a real event. Like the fall is real, right? It's real, but exactly what happened in the fall and how it came about is something that it's not clear, but we do know that original sin is true. You look around the world, it's the most obvious fact, right? That we all are not in the state that we need to be in. So I think, in the book I tried to give here's some different ways that people have looked at this, and if the church, is definitive rules, I'm going to submit to what the church says, but I do think there are ways of looking at this that can reconcile sort of, genetic data and what the church teaches. So I think but it's interesting. I find students are always interested in this in the class, and so I'll say, well, here's some ways of thinking about it. What do you guys think? And making it clear, this is what the church has said, and this is what's allowed and what isn't allowed, and what the church hasn't ruled on.
Right. Yeah. So let's bring that around, because this is it's done by Scripture. So let's bring it around, and let's think about Genesis 1 and 2. And obviously, those are foundational passages of Scripture. So, how do you read those as a scientist, and from your perspective and your understanding of the development of life on Earth and so on? What do you think is being communicated by those narratives? Genesis 1 obviously is the more panoramic sweep of kind of this orderly creation being constructed, and then Genesis 2 is looking more at the origin of the human person, has a lot more, the origin of marriage and so on. So, what's the theological truth? We're both at some point going to say, there's figurative language going on here, but there's real events as well. So there's some kind of historical basis. So how do you understand that?
Yeah, I look at that, and I take a lot of this from what I've read from Pope Benedict, and I think I'd like how he views this and how he talks about this. I'm sure there's much more profound thoughts that he has than I'm going to give you.
Right.
But chapter 1 of Genesis, this is sort of this. It's sort of mytho-history, right? It's this history in a sense that we don't fully understand, but it is a myth, which is a myth is not something that's fake. It's something that's a story to reveal real truths about what has happened, but it's not meant to be a literal description. And I think that the things that I take away from the Genesis 1, right? I think it's showing, like you mentioned, that there's chaos, at the beginning, and God brings order. God gives order to everything, right? And so the order that exists in creation is a reflection of God's rationality and God's goodness. The second thing is creation is good, right? The physical world is good, right? God, everything God creates is good. And then, the culmination of creation is, human, right? And the culmination of creation is worship, right? So there's
Yeah.
7, right?
Yeah, 100%.
And so all of creation is geared towards worship. We are at the end of creation because we are more geared. All creation praises God, right? But we are meant to praise God in a very unique way, right? And so that to me shows that humans are unique amongst all of creation. Creation is good and it's ordered, right? And so it's not just chaos and chance, right?
Right.
And then, as you get to Genesis 2, it's more, like you said, about humans. What are we? Who we are, and the marital relationship between man and women, and then you get to the fall after that. But I think that, to me, that beautiful line of God takes the dirt of the earth, the afar, right, and breathes life into that, and that is that we are part of creation. We are the material being, right? That's the dirt, and and to me, that's that we are part of this sort of evolutionary. This is not in Scripture, but I see that resonates with this idea that we are part of this physical evolutionary process. But we are more than that, that God breathes life into us. We have this immaterial soul. We are a unity of body and soul. And that, to me, is what it's getting at there in Genesis 2. And that doesn't take away from anything that I've learned from science, right? It's showing that, however, it doesn't specify what, that dirt, what does it look like? To me, but we are a physical thing, and that man and women are sort of.
So you understand, the creation of the body out of the dirt, you're seeing that as that's bespeaking our, common material and animal nature that we share with the rest of the cosmos, with the cats and the dogs and the plants and so on.
We're made of the same stuff as the sun and the moon and so forth. We are part of the
But
created.
then elevated. Sure.
That's I'd see that. And then, clearly, God created us in union with Him. We're good. And then the fall is a real event. So there's 2 real events. There is a moment of creation. So when you say, well, humans are created, yes, they were, because, but I also think humans have evolved. It's a both and that there is a moment in which the first human comes into existence. So it's not a 3/4 human. There's not a half a human. It is a ontological discontinuity that there's some. Benedict talks about the soul and the body, how a certain form calls forth for a soul out of justice. And you think of like why in the IVF process, right, this immoral process of bringing apart a human life, that soul, God in justice, gives that thing a soul, because it is the physical thing that is, just to have a rational soul, right? And I think at a certain point in the evolutionary process, when that comes into being, in the first time, God gives that rational soul, and that brings life. It brings humans into existence where there was no humans before, right? In a very real way.
No, I appreciate that. I respect your deference to the church's establishment of certain parameters of understanding this and trying to respect the, original state of justice, original sin, a historical fall, a rebellion. And this is the problem with Teilhard de Chardin. He tried to our sin is just this leftover from our animal nature, and so on. You spoke of discontinuities, and when I was reading your book, I often thought myself thinking, do you accept the cosmic fine-tuning argument for God's existence? Do you think and you're familiar with that, right?
No, I think that's a good argument for the existence of God. Again, the idea that, first of all, the question, so why does something exist rather than nothing? Why does, there needs to be a source of existence. No matter how the cosmos is structured, there's an argument for a creator. This is a contingent thing. It's a physical thing. How does it come into being? There's got to be a creator that brings, being itself that doesn't have to be brought into existence. So there's that. But then when you look at this cosmos, it's not just any cosmos, it's a very specific one, that's got a certain structure to it. It's absolutely essential for us to be here and for life to exist. And it's absolutely, and I make the point in the book, it's absolutely essential for the evolutionary process to work. Without the order at the subatomic level, that physicists can describe, but they can't explain why it's there, right? So I can explain why I'm ordered physically because of the proteins that are ordered, and those are ordered because of the atoms that have a certain structure, but the atoms are structured because of the underlying physical constants. But you get to that level where you're hitting the base level of physical reality, right?
Yeah.
And why is the base level of physical reality so ordered?
Yeah.
To allow for 80 roughly stable elements to exist. And that's where science reaches a dead end. And you get to metaphysics. You go below physics. Well, why do we have that order? And I think that there are two real responses. One is, well, there is behind creation, there is a source of that order. There is reason. There's rationality and order. It comes from the ultimate source of that, which is God.
Yeah.
And the other is, it just is.
You're right.
I don't find intellectually
don't find satisfying. Yeah, okay.
So I don't see. I mean, you can have the multiverse argument,
Sure.
but that just collapses back into the same question,
Right. Yeah,
So I think it's really just those two arguments.
Those
right?
two
I don't
options.
see a third option.
Yeah. And Stephen Meyer I just watched a YouTube with him. He was on Matt Fradd, same argument. And I agree. Now, when I was reading your book, you use the term order a lot. Once in a while, you'll say design. Do you mean something different by order than design?
Well, I think.
Or does sometimes it's synonymous?
Yeah, sometimes they're synonymous, and I think that the order in creation, right, that you see, that fine-tuned order there, is suggestive of design. Right? But there could be order that might not be suggestive of design in the moment. But I think like you could get order in just the way magnet filings arrange, and so that the order of the magnet filings is not by design. It's just but there's order in the magnetic field, and there's order in why you have this. So if you follow it down further enough. Far enough, you reach a point where order is suggestive of design. But in the moment, I don't have to say, oh, there's a designer that designed these magnets, right? Yeah.
Well, when I teach on this, I actually have a PowerPoint that I use, and I go through a whole bunch of different scenes, and I ask my students, okay, are we perceiving noise, order, or design? Noise is, there's no perceivable pattern, right? And order, though, is not necessarily design because, for example, you can have like a Mandelbrot set, and that is highly ordered, but there's not a message there, there's not a signal, and it's not functional, right? But then you look at a seagull or a sculpture or something like that, and there you see, oh, there's telos, there's purpose, there's functionality. There. When you can get order from a mathematical formula, and some of the orders that result are very beautiful, but they're repetitive. But it seems to me that what we see when we look at a living organism is clearly not just order. It's not reducible to mathematical formula. We're getting functional information there, and the obvious product of a mind, because merely mechanistic processes don't produce purposeful information. And now I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but when I was reading the book, and I'm thinking to myself, what is different from how I view things from how Dan is thinking about this stuff? And what it comes down to is, in my major objection to evolutionary theory as it's usually presented, and as you present it is different, by far than, say, how Richard Dawkins,
Right,
you know, and he's an extreme, but I don't know. Well, you know, the mainstream presentation of evolutionary theory is very emphasizes the mechanistic and the thoughtlessness of it. But what it comes down to is I don't believe that a mindless mechanistic process can create new meaningful information. I believe in the conservation of information, that if you have a closed informational situation, that within an informationally closed environment, information can only stay the same or degrade. And the claim of Darwinism, and I understand that you're not a classic Darwinist, but the claim of Darwinism seems to be that we set up this mindless mechanistic process of random mutation plus natural selection, and it's an algorithm, and we just let it run, and it's going to produce all kinds of meaningful information. Because I don't think it's possible for us to deny that when you look at biology, we have like an amazing amount of meaningful information, in coded information in all these different life forms. And I'm highly influenced by my fourth grade gifted and talented teacher, Diane Enders of Harbor Elementary School in New London, Connecticut, who first taught me to program. And she taught me the law of conservation of information, which she phrased as GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. You know, she was teaching us these are primitive personal computers that we had back in the 80s. And she said, look, the computer will never do anything more intelligent than you tell it to do. And to think otherwise is magical thinking, you know, and boy, time after time that was borne out in experience. You know, the mechanism did what I told it to do. It pumped out the information that I put in, or there's pass-through information too, you know, if I'm making it dynamic so it has inputs and outputs and it'll process information. But there's conservation of information there. It's not thinking on its own, you know. And so do you view the mechanism of Darwinism, do you view that as a mindless mechanistic process that's producing functional information?
Yeah. So I would argue that the natural evolutionary process, right, is producing new information over time, right? And why is it and how is it doing that? Well, it's doing that because it is an ordered system, because of the order that's instilled into creation at the very beginning. And it's important to, like, information, right? We use that term often to mean different things, right? And so, you know, everything in the universe has information in it, and that it has information to decrease uncertainty. Like, that's the carbon atom. You say it's got information that makes it different than a oxygen atom, right? And so, like, when we talk about a DNA, right, people are always like, well, there's the letters in the DNA, and then we start to think of rating a book, and we think of human information. But in reality, the information in the DNA is just sort of chemical information. It's chemical bonds. It's
bonding. It's instructions, right? And we have, but it's translated and it's implemented into proteins.
It is, but it's just chemical bonds. It's chemical bonds binding here, and that gives some.
This is just chemical ink on paper, too.
Right. The reason that has meaning, right, is because you have a mind, right, to be able to extract meaning. So that's one type of information. So, and we're trying to use that term sort of analogously for DNA. It's not as if the cell reads, oh, GAT. No, that's a T, that's an A. No, all that happens is things, right? But it's not even reading letters, right? It's just chemical bonding going on. And I don't need to say just, because it's amazing what it does, right? But it's not putting information content on top, like taking a T, right, and saying that T is going to have this meaning. These two lines are going to have this meaning. It's just saying that this bonding is now associated with this protein, this codon that has this amino acid that happens to be attached to it. but that information there is in the chemical bond, right? Just like there's information when any two proteins come together, right? And they bond, right? So there's information all the way up and down creation.
I agree with that.
And it comes from the order that is instilled in creation at the beginning, and then can produce varied types of information, right? And so
this is where you sound like a front-loaded design theorist. You're basically saying the information necessary is in the initial conditions. Is that correct? Or?
Well, I wouldn't. Front-loaded design often means different things. So like there's some front-loaded designers that say, well, the first organism had all the DNA in it that's needed. I don't think that front-loaded design.
Yeah.
But I think that the order that's in creation is enough to produce all the information that's going to be needed in the evolutionary process. But it's not dictating it in a deterministic way, right? So it's, the way the information plays out, it's going to be, there's some chance elements to it. But what information and it's going to work and how you're going to sort through that information and so forth is fully dependent upon the source of that order that's there at the beginning of creation.
Yeah, and you have a passage that that talks about that, and let me do a detour, but which is, I have to beg your patience, which is going to sound irrelevant for a minute, but you'll see why it is relevant. So, perpetual motion machines. I assume you do not believe that such things exist.
Right.
Okay. And if your student came to you and said, Dr. Kuebler, I made a perpetual motion machine in my dorm room, you think, okay, let me go look. Or I don't know how you'd react to that, but you'd be suspicious, I'm sure. And if this was operating in the student's dorm room, you'd probably think, well, there's kind of some hidden source of energy going on, right, because of that. Okay. So, and, let me pose something interesting to you. Do you think God could create a perpetual motion machine?
Well, I think as long as it's not a logical contradiction that God could do that. And there could be a universe where that's not a logical contradiction, or he could maintain a perpetual motion machine in this universe, right?
Yeah, okay, all right.
By supplying whatever miraculous needs are there.
Well, it would be it would have to be miraculous,
Right,
some kind of like,
Okay.
I would say, those kind of questions, it's kind of like, can God make a rock too heavy for himself to lift, right?
Yeah.
And there's like, well, God can't make logical contradictions. He can't make a married bachelor, right? And so, can God make a perpetual motion machine? Not really. If
A self-sustaining.
he could make, he could like ordain that something like sustain it, okay?
Yeah.
But this comes back around to like a passage in your book where I really think that you reveal kind of your deep thought on this, which is on 123. It says, and you're critiquing Fatuma here. I hope I'm Douglas Fatuma. I hope I'm pronouncing his name. Is that how?
I think he's an evolutionary biologist.
Is that how it's usually pronounced?
Yeah.
Okay, Fatuma. Okay, so. And I agree with you. I don't agree with Fatuma, and I think you critique him, but you say it's quite possible that God could have created a world in which natural forces alone could not only produce living organisms of all kinds, but produce exactly the kinds of living organisms that he desired. And and then you go on and say, such a world would have been designed from the very beginning for his purposes. And that's where, to me, you sound like you're essentially a front-loaded design guy, because you're talking about the world being designed for purposes, from the initial condition. Now, what I balk at is when you say natural forces alone could have produced living organisms of all kinds, because I understand natural forces to mean something like natural laws. And I don't believe laws can produce meaningful information. Laws produce regularities, and laws can produce order. But when we look at living things, they're not just ordered, they are innovatively designed. They are not just like, say, a beautiful crystalline structure where you got, crystals are ordered, okay? A swan or a mouse is more like a Shakespeare play or a Bach cantata than they are, a beautiful Mandelbrot set. Because the mouse and the swan cannot be reduced to mathematical formulae. And so I don't think laws alone can produce all living organisms, because laws produce regularity. Maybe laws could have produced one living thing, because laws always do the same thing. That's why we call them laws, and forces likewise. But it seems to me that when we look at living things, they evince the qualities of thoughtfulness. Living things demonstrate innovation. Living things demonstrate creativity. It's like when you look at a bat, you think, wow, a bat presents creative engineering solutions to the constraints of the physical environment that it's in.
Yeah.
That doesn't look like the operation of natural laws to me. That looks like an engineering genius, okay? So, I don't know, respond to that.
Yeah,
what
I
do you
wouldn't
think?
say like natural processes. I wouldn't equate them with natural laws. Like,
Okay.
like it could be a natural process. Is just a tree falling in the forest would be a natural process. There's a law behind it, but the fact that the tree falls in the direction that it is, there's no law that from all eternity that tree's got to fall over there. So natural laws play a role sort of in the evolutionary process because they set the order, they set the foundation of how things work. But as real objects with real causative power play out and interact in the world, certain things are produced, right? And I think it's pretty clear, like if you have oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen, they interact in the world to produce new things, and we know that. With no, like you look at any meteor and you find amino acids there. So I'm just like, so the idea, and you find different types of amino acids. It's not like there's these things, not like carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen are always going to produce X, right? It's like depending on the conditions and how they interact, they can produce this amino acid, or they can produce, this amino acid, or so forth, right? And so as things interact in a complex environment, they have the ability to do things that are going to, in a sense, transcend simple natural laws, but they flow up from the order of the fundamental properties that we find in nature, right? And so protons and neutrons can come together to form different atoms under different conditions, but there's certain ones they can't form, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just not feasible to
Right.
form those given the conditions that we have. And then and at every level you get more complexity, because now you have these atoms, they can interact with each other under different conditions and produce things. And then if you put some of those together, and some of those are driven by natural laws, like biological membranes, seems to be driven large part by natural laws. Hydrophobic, and certain oils don't like water, and that can drive the formation of membranes. And just having different initial conditions. Michael Denton has papers on this that shows how you get different folds of membranes just by mixing different things together, right?
Yeah.
And so this order and different complexity emerge from the interaction of these things. And it's not a law-like process, but it's dependent on laws, but there's a fecundity in the natural world, in the physical world, like where each level becomes, to me, more surprising. But it all depends upon that order that's there at the beginning.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think we'd probably end up differing on whether the laws of physics and chemistry are sufficient to create living things. I think they stop short. I think they provide a foundation, but that there has to be an infusion of information to get from the non-biotic to the biotic. But that's that's another time. Yeah. Dr. Daniel Kuebler, thank you so much. You're brilliant. You're humble. You respect the teaching of the church. So again, Darwin and Doctrine, misnamed because I don't believe Dr. Kuebler is, truly a Darwinist.
No,
I hope you're not really a Darwinist.
No, so they picked the title of the book.
Yeah, and I understand alliteration.
That. I didn't have the, but I'm like, okay,
I've had that happen to myself. Like the editor, the publisher chooses the title, and then you're stuck with it.
Yeah,
and I've had that happen to me as well. So the book should really be titled something like a Catholic explores the dynamic of revelation, reason, and nature. Something like that.
I think my title was somewhere along those lines, and a Catholic approach to evolution and creation, or something like that.
Yeah.
But it wasn't as catchy as the alliteration of Darwin and Doctrine. So
as this is. Well, anyway, thank you so much for your time and for being on the show. It's highly appreciated.
Thanks, John. I really enjoyed talking to you.